Hey, settle in, get comfortable. Dim the lights if you can, let the world fade a little. Tonight, we're going back to the 3rd century BCE, to a time when two civilizations, both convinced of their own superiority, both expanding relentlessly, were on a collision course. Rome and Carthage. One land power, one sea power. One republic of farmers turned soldiers, one merchant empire built on trade and naval dominance. They controlled opposite ends of the Mediterranean, and for a while, that was enough. But the Mediterranean isn't infinite. And empires don't stay in their corners. What followed was 118 years of intermittent warfare so brutal, so total, that it reshaped the ancient world. 3 separate wars. Hundreds of thousands dead. Entire fleets destroyed. Cities razed to the ground and salted so nothing would ever grow again. This is the story of the Punic Wars. Not just battles and generals, though we'll cover those in detail. But the tactics, the strategies, the innovations in military engineering that turned warfare into science, how Rome learned, slowly, painfully, that courage and numbers weren't enough. How Carthage discovered that brilliance without resources eventually fails, and how one of these powers would emerge as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean, while the other would be erased so completely that we know their history primarily through their enemies' accounts. Let's begin at the beginning. Before the wars. When two very different civilizations were busy conquering their own worlds, unaware they'd soon be trying to conquer each other, Carthage was old, ancient by Mediterranean standards. Founded around 814 BCE by Phoenician colonists from Tyre in modern Lebanon, it started as a trading post on the North African coast in what's now Tunisia. The location was perfect. A natural harbour, defensible headland, positioned right in the middle of the Mediterranean's major trade routes. Within a few centuries, Carthage had evolved from colony to independent power to imperial metropolis. Its harbour could accommodate hundreds of ships. Its circular military harbour, the Kothon, was an engineering marvel, with covered docking bays radiating from a central island command post. The city's walls were among the most formidable in the ancient world. Triple-layered fortifications, over 40 feet tall in places, thick enough that stables and barracks were built into them, towers every 200 feet. And at the weakest point, where the city connected to the mainland, the walls were 6 stories tall and wide enough for elephants, yes, war elephants, to pass on top. Carthage's wealth came from trade. Obsessively, relentlessly, successfully. They controlled ports across North Africa, southern Spain, western Sicily, Sardinia, Corsica. They traded in everything, silver and tin from Spain, gold from Africa, textiles, dyes, especially Tyrian purple, worth more than gold, grain, wine, slaves, ivory, wild animals for Roman games. And they had the navy to protect it all. The Carthaginian fleet was legendary. Hundreds of warships, primarily quinqueremes, massive vessels with 5 rows of oars and reinforced bronze rams designed to punch through enemy hulls below the waterline. Carthaginian sailors were professionals. Career naval personnel who spent their entire lives at sea learning currents, weather patterns, navigation and combat tactics. They could outmaneuver anyone, outfight anyone. Control the sea meant control of trade, and Carthage controlled the sea. Rome, in 264 BCE, was different. Completely different. It was a land power, always had been. The Romans were farmers, primarily, landowners who fought when necessary, but returned to their fields when wars ended. Their military tradition was infantry-based, heavy foot soldiers, the legions, organized and disciplined, but fundamentally terrestrial. Rome's expansion had been methodical. Starting from a single city, they'd conquered the Italian peninsula through a combination of military force, strategic alliances, and ruthless pragmatism. Defeat an enemy, then offer them partnership, junior partnership always, within Rome's growing confederation. By 264 BCE, Rome controlled all of Italy south of the Po River. That's significant territory, significant population, significant manpower reserves. But it was all land-based. Rome had no navy, barely any naval tradition. Romans didn't fish much, didn't trade by sea much, didn't think in terms of maritime power. Their military strength was the legion, 4,000 to 5,000 men organized into maniples, small, flexible units that could adapt to terrain and tactical situations. Each soldier was a citizen farmer serving for the campaign season, then returning home. They weren't professional soldiers like Carthaginian mercenaries. They were militiamen, though well-trained and highly disciplined militiamen. Roman tactics emphasized close combat, heavy infantry with large shields, the scutum, short swords, the gladius, and throwing spears, the pilum. Get close, throw spears to disrupt enemy formations, then charge in with swords. Brutal, effective, simple, but entirely land-based. Rome had conquered Italy without needing ships. They'd fought Samnites, Etruscans, Greek colonies in southern Italy, all land battles. The sea was someone else's problem. Until it wasn't. Sicily was the problem. That large island between Italy and North Africa, strategically positioned, agriculturally rich, politically fragmented. The eastern part was controlled by the Greek city of Syracuse, powerful, independent, playing its own game. The western part was Carthaginian, colonies and client cities tied to Carthage's trading network. And in the northeast, the city of Messana, modern Messina, was controlled by the Mamertines. Who were the Mamertines? Italian mercenaries who'd seized the city through treachery, murdered the male population, married the widows, and established themselves as the new ruling class. Charming people. Around 265 BCE, Syracuse decided to deal with the Mamertine problem. King Hero II besieged Messana. The Mamertines, desperate, asked for help from everyone. Simultaneously, they asked Carthage. Carthage sent a garrison, not to help the Mamertines really, but to prevent Syracuse from controlling the straits separating Sicily from Italy. The Mamertines then betrayed Carthage, shocking I know, and asked Rome for help instead. Rome debated. This was unprecedented. Intervening in Sicily meant crossing the sea, fighting Carthage, a major power, starting something that could spiral into a much larger conflict. But the strategic calculation won. If Carthage or Syracuse controlled Messana, they controlled the straits. They could threaten southern Italy. Better to intervene now than face a stronger enemy later. Rome agreed to help. They sent forces across the straits in 264 BCE. And just like that, Rome and Carthage were at war. Neither probably wanted it. Neither had planned for it. But once armies were committed, once prestige was engaged, retreat became impossible. The First Punic War had begun. By accident. Over a city neither power particularly cared about, because that's often how wars start, not through grand strategy, but through incremental commitments that suddenly become irreversible. But let's understand what each side brought to this conflict. Carthage had money, enormous wealth from centuries of trade. They could hire armies, mercenaries from across the Mediterranean. Iberians, Gauls, Numidians, Greeks. Professional soldiers who fought for pay, not patriotism. This was both strength and weakness. Mercenaries were experienced, skilled, diverse. But they fought for money. Lose too many battles, fail to pay them, and loyalty evaporated. Carthaginian armies were capable but fragile. Carthage's navy was its real strength. Hundreds of warships, professional crews, tactical sophistication developed over centuries. Control the sea, and you control Sicily. Control Sicily, and you control the central Mediterranean. The strategic logic was clear. Rome had manpower, massive reserves of it. Not just Roman citizens, but Italian allies obligated to provide troops. Lose a legion, raise another. Lose an army, raise two more. Rome's confederation system meant it could absorb losses that would cripple other states. But Rome had no navy, none. Romans were landlubbers. The sea was alien territory, tactically and psychologically. This asymmetry defined the First Punic War. Carthage dominant at sea, Rome dominant on land. Neither able to deliver a knockout blow because they were fighting in different elements. There was another asymmetry. Command structure. Carthage's generals had autonomy. Once appointed, they controlled their armies with minimal interference from Carthage's Senate. This allowed flexibility, quick decision-making, adaptation to circumstances. But it also meant that competent generals, and Carthage produced some of the greatest military minds in history, could become threats to Carthaginian political factions. Jealousy, suspicion, and political infighting often undermined military success. Carthage would sometimes recall successful generals or deny them resources because political rivals feared their growing influence. Rome's command was different. 2 consuls elected annually, each commanding armies for 1-year terms. Then they returned to civilian life. This prevented military strongmen from accumulating too much power, usually, but it also meant inconsistent command quality. Some years you got competent generals. Some years you got aristocratic idiots who'd bought their way to consulship and had no business leading armies. Roman military success often depended on luck of the electoral draw. And annual terms meant no long-term strategy. A consul might start a brilliant campaign, then his term ended, and his successor pursued an entirely different approach. Continuity was difficult. Both systems had flaws. Both would cost their respective states dearly, but both would also produce moments of genius that shaped history. So here we are, 264 BC. 2 powers, roughly equal in strength but completely different in nature, about to fight over an island neither originally wanted. Rome, massive manpower, disciplined infantry, no naval experience, annual rotating command, fighting for strategic security and increasingly for prestige. Carthage, vast wealth, mercenary armies, naval dominance, autonomous generals subject to political interference, fighting to maintain trade networks and regional hegemony. The Mediterranean wasn't big enough for both of them, not because of ideology or culture or religion, but because empires expand until they meet resistance. And when 2 expanding empires meet, only 3 outcomes are possible. 1 submits, both coexist peacefully, or they fight. Submission wasn't in either nation's character. Peaceful coexistence required trust, neither possessed. So they fought for 23 years in the First War. Then again for 17 years in the Second, then once more, briefly and brutally, in the Third. By the end, one would be the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. The other would be erased, literally. City destroyed, population enslaved or killed, territory absorbed, even the name eventually forgotten by most people who weren't historians. This is the story of how that happened. The tactics, the strategies, the battles, the innovations, the mistakes, and the lessons learned in blood. It's a story about warfare, but also about adaptation, about how Rome, defeated repeatedly, learned and evolved, about how Carthage, brilliant and wealthy, ultimately couldn't overcome structural weaknesses, and about how 118 years of intermittent war transformed the entire Mediterranean world, setting the stage for Roman imperial dominance that would last half a millennium. Tonight, let that setup settle in your mind. 2 civilizations, each dominant in their own sphere. One controlling the sea, the other the land. Both expanding. Both confident. Both about to discover that confidence isn't enough. The wars haven't started yet. We're standing at the edge, looking at Rome and Carthage across the narrow straits separating Sicily from Italy, knowing what's coming but not yet watching it unfold. That comes next. The battles, the bloodshed, the tactical innovations, the strategic miscalculations, the moments of genius and the catastrophic mistakes. The way warfare evolved as both sides adapted to each other, creating an arms race of tactics and technology. But for now, just understand this: the Punic Wars weren't inevitable until suddenly they were. Weren't about survival until they became existential. Weren't total until both sides committed everything. And once committed, once the prestige and resources were engaged, once the dead started piling up and revenge became a factor, retreat became impossible. The Mediterranean would have one master. The question was which one, and how much blood it would cost to decide. The war began on land. That made sense. Rome knew land warfare. Carthage's mercenary armies, while professional, faced Roman legions on familiar ground. The Romans crossed the straits in 264 BCE and quickly drove the Carthaginian garrison out of Messana. Then they pushed further into Sicily, besieging Syracuse until King Hero II, reading the tactical situation clearly, switched sides and became Rome's ally. Smart move. Syracuse would survive the wars largely intact by knowing when to back the winning side. But Rome had a problem. They could win land battles in Sicily all day long. Didn't matter. Carthage controlled the sea. They could resupply their coastal cities by ship, bypass Roman armies entirely, raid the Italian coast, and make the war economically unsustainable for Rome. Rome realized something uncomfortable. You can't win a war against a naval power without a navy, so they decided to build one. From scratch. With zero experience. In the middle of a war. This sounds insane. It was insane. It also worked. The story, possibly apocryphal but too good not to tell, is that a Carthaginian quinquereme ran aground on the Italian coast around 261 BCE. The Romans captured it, studied it, and used it as a template. They reverse-engineered an entire warship, measured every dimension, examined how the oars were arranged, how the hull was constructed, how the ram was attached. Then they started building copies. Lots of them. Within 2 months, 60 days, Rome launched 100 quinqueremes and 20 triremes. Within a year, they had a fleet of 330 warships. The construction was frantic, crude, rushed. The ships weren't as well built as Carthaginian vessels. They were heavier, less maneuverable, more likely to take on water in rough seas. But they floated. They had rams, and Rome filled them with soldiers. Here's where Roman ingenuity showed itself. They knew they couldn't outmaneuver Carthaginian ships. Their crews were inexperienced farmers who'd barely seen the ocean, while Carthaginian sailors had been at sea their entire professional lives. So Rome changed the rules. They invented a device called the corvus, the raven. The corvus was brilliant in its simplicity. A boarding bridge, about 36 feet long and 4 feet wide, mounted on a rotating pole near the ship's bow. At the far end, a heavy spike shaped like a bird's beak. When a Roman ship approached an enemy vessel, the corvus swung into position, then dropped. The spike punched through the enemy deck, locking the two ships together. Now it wasn't a naval battle. It was a land battle on water. Roman soldiers, marines essentially, stormed across the bridge, shields up, swords drawn. They fought on the enemy deck like they'd fight on a battlefield. And Romans were very, very good at close-quarters combat. The corvus neutralized Carthaginian naval superiority. Suddenly, maneuverability didn't matter. Ramming tactics didn't matter. All that mattered was who won the fight once the ships were locked together. And Rome won those fights. Almost always. The first major naval battle was at Mylae in 260 BCE. Roman consul Gaius Duilius commanded a fleet that was laughably inexperienced. Carthaginian admiral Hannibal Gisco, not that Hannibal, different guy, commanded professional warships with crews who'd trained for years. The Carthaginians approached confidently, planning to ram the clumsy Roman ships and sink them methodically. Then the corvuses dropped. 30 Carthaginian ships were boarded and captured in the first engagement. Hannibal Gisco fled. Rome won its first naval victory ever, despite having a navy that was barely 3 months old. This shouldn't have worked, but it did. Because Rome adapted, they took their strength, infantry combat, and found a way to apply it to their weakness, naval warfare. But the corvus had problems. It made ships top-heavy. The weight of the boarding bridge high on the prow made vessels unstable in rough seas. Roman fleets suffered catastrophic losses in storms, not from enemy action, but from their own ships capsizing. In 255 BCE, a fleet of 364 ships was caught in a storm off the southern coast of Sicily. Around 284 ships sank. Tens of thousands drowned. It's one of the largest naval disasters in recorded history. Rome rebuilt the fleet. Lost another fleet to storms in 253 BCE. Rebuilt again. Lost a third fleet in 249 BCE. The casualties were staggering. Economically, the losses were crushing. But Rome kept building ships, kept training crews, kept throwing resources at the sea until they learned how to survive on it. Carthage couldn't match this. Not because they lacked shipbuilding capacity, they had better shipyards, but because they couldn't replace crews. Professional sailors take years to train. You can't just draft farmers and turn them into competent naval personnel in a few months. Rome's willingness to accept catastrophic losses and just keep going was a strategic advantage. A horrifying one, built on thousands of drowned bodies, but an advantage nonetheless. The land war in Sicily ground into stalemate. Rome controlled most of the interior. Carthage held several coastal fortresses, notably Lilybaeum and Drepana in the west. Roman armies besieged these cities repeatedly, failed repeatedly. Carthaginian naval superiority, even with the Corvus, they still had advantages in open water, allowed them to resupply by sea. Siege warfare was brutal, slow. Cities could hold out for years if supplied. And Rome was learning, painfully, that taking fortified positions required more than courage and discipline. In 256 BCE, Rome tried a different approach. Instead of fighting in Sicily, attack Carthage directly. Consuls Marcus Atilius Regulus and Lucius Manlius Vulso led a fleet of 330 warships carrying roughly 140,000 soldiers and sailors across the Mediterranean to invade North Africa. The fleet encountered Carthaginian forces off Cape Ecnomus. Both sides fielded over 300 ships. This was the largest naval battle in ancient history, possibly in all history before the modern era. The details are murky. Ancient sources are contradictory, but Rome won decisively. Their infantry on water tactics worked again. They broke through Carthaginian lines, boarded ships, captured or sank dozens of enemy vessels. The way to Carthage was open. Regulus landed in North Africa with about 15,000 infantry and 500 cavalry. He ravaged the countryside around Carthage, burning crops, destroying villages, enslaving populations. Standard ancient warfare. Carthage panicked, sought peace. Regulus's terms were harsh, absurdly harsh. Carthage would abandon Sicily entirely, pay enormous indemnities, reduce its navy to a token force, and essentially become a Roman client state. Carthage refused. They'd rather fight than accept subjugation. They hired a Spartan mercenary commander named Xanthippus. This was a good decision. Xanthippus was professional, experienced, and understood something crucial. Carthage's strength wasn't infantry, it was cavalry and elephants. Xanthippus reorganized Carthaginian forces, trained them, then led them against Regulus's army in 255 BCE at the Battle of Tunis. The Carthaginians fielded 12,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and roughly 100 war elephants. Regulus had superior infantry, but almost no cavalry, and had never faced elephants in battle. Elephants are terrifying. Their massive, African war elephants stood about 10 feet tall at the shoulder, weighed several tons. They were armored with leather or metal plating, sometimes had blades attached to their tusks. And they charged. Roman soldiers had never encountered anything like them. Horses panicked at the smell, infantry formations broke under the charge. And while Romans were dealing with elephants, Carthaginian cavalry, especially Numidian horsemen, among the best light cavalry in the ancient world, swept around the flanks. Regulus's army was destroyed. About 12,000 Romans killed, 2,000 captured, including Regulus himself. Only about 2,000 escaped to the coast and evacuation. The invasion of Africa was over. Rome's attempt at a quick victory had failed catastrophically. Legend says Regulus was sent to Rome years later to negotiate his own ransom and exchange of prisoners. He supposedly advised the Senate to reject Carthage's terms, then returned to Carthage knowing he'd be tortured to death for his advice. Probably didn't happen. It's too perfect, the noble Roman choosing honor over survival. But Romans loved the story. It embodied their idealized values: duty, sacrifice, refusing to yield even under threat of death. True or not, it reveals something about Roman self-conception. They saw themselves as tougher, more disciplined, more willing to sacrifice than their enemies. This self-image drove their strategic decisions, sometimes disastrously, sometimes successfully. The war dragged on. Years of sieges, skirmishes, naval battles. Both sides exhausted. Both bleeding resources. Neither able to land a decisive blow. By 247 BCE, Carthage appointed a new commander in Sicily, Hamilcar Barca, father of Hannibal, and one of the most capable generals Carthage ever produced. Hamilcar changed the game. Instead of defending fixed positions, he waged guerrilla warfare, raiding Roman supply lines, ambushing isolated units, avoiding direct battle, making the occupation of Sicily expensive and dangerous. He couldn't win the war. Carthage's resources were too depleted, but he could make it hurt. And he did. Rome, meanwhile, was also exhausted. The treasury was empty. The Senate couldn't fund another fleet. So wealthy citizens did something unprecedented. They privately financed the construction of 200 warships, loans to the state that might never be repaid. This fleet, commanded by Consul Gaius Lutatius Catulus, sailed to Sicily in 242 BCE. They blockaded Carthaginian positions, cutting off supplies. Carthage sent a relief fleet in 241 BCE. The Battle of the Aegates Islands was decisive. Roman ships, now crewed by experienced sailors, not farmers, defeated the Carthaginian fleet. Sank 50 ships, captured 70 more. Carthage couldn't replace that loss. Couldn't fund another fleet, couldn't supply their forces in Sicily. Hamilcar, undefeated on land, was ordered to negotiate peace. The treaty was harsh but not crippling. Carthage evacuated Sicily entirely, paid Rome 3,200 talents of silver, a massive sum but not impossible. Released all Roman prisoners without ransom. Sicily became Rome's first overseas province, a new model of imperial expansion. Not alliance, not confederation, but direct control and taxation. Both sides were exhausted. Rome had lost hundreds of thousands, mostly to storms and disease rather than combat. Carthage had spent its treasury and lost its richest island possession. But the war taught lessons. Rome learned it could build a navy from nothing through sheer determination and willingness to absorb losses. They learned combined arms warfare, siege tactics, and that technological innovation, like the Corvus, could overcome experience gaps. Carthage learned that mercenary armies, however skilled, were fragile. That wealth alone didn't guarantee victory. That Roman manpower reserves were deeper than they'd imagined, and Hamilcar Barca learned something else. Something dangerous. That Rome could be beaten. Not through traditional methods, not head-on battles where Roman discipline and numbers prevailed, but through mobility, surprise, and exploiting weaknesses. He'd teach these lessons to his son, a boy who'd grown up hating Rome, who'd sworn an oath to never be Rome's friend, who'd become the greatest tactical mind of the ancient world. But that comes later. For now, in 241 BCE, there's peace. Exhausted, resentful, temporary peace. Both powers licking their wounds. Both rebuilding, both knowing, probably, that this isn't over. The First Punic War had ended, but it had set the stage for something worse. Peace didn't mean recovery, not for Carthage. The war had cost them Sicily, their richest possession, source of grain, staging point for Mediterranean trade. The indemnity payments drained the treasury, and now they had a new problem. Their mercenaries wanted to be paid. Carthage had employed thousands of foreign soldiers during the war. Libyans, Iberians, Gauls, Greeks, Numidians. Professional fighters who'd served loyally, suffered losses, and expected compensation. Carthage stalled. The money wasn't there. The treasury was empty. Maybe later. Maybe partial payment. Maybe the mercenaries weren't interested in maybes. In 240 BCE, roughly 20,000 unpaid mercenaries revolted. They were joined by Libyan subjects, African peoples under Carthaginian control, who saw an opportunity to break free. Suddenly, Carthage faced a massive uprising right on its doorstep. This wasn't a war, it was an existential crisis. The mercenary war, sometimes called the Truceless War, because neither side gave or expected quarter, was fought with extraordinary brutality. Mercenaries besieged Carthage itself, cut off supplies, crucified Carthaginian prisoners. The city was starving, desperate, on the edge of collapse. Carthage recalled Hamilcar Barca. He'd been the one general who hadn't lost in Sicily, who'd kept fighting effectively despite impossible odds. Now he faced an even worse situation at home. Hamilcar was ruthless. Brilliant and ruthless. He couldn't match the rebels in numbers, so he used deception, mobility, and psychological warfare. He set rebel factions against each other, bribed some, crushed others, forced battles where he had advantages and avoided them where he didn't. At the Battle of the Soar, he trapped a rebel army against a mountain range and annihilated it, killing roughly 40,000. Not defeated, killed. Almost no prisoners taken. The war lasted 3 years. When it ended in 237 BCE, Carthage had survived but barely. The Libyan revolt was crushed. The mercenaries were dead or scattered. But the cost was enormous. And Carthage learned a lesson. Mercenary armies were a strategic weakness. They could win battles, but they weren't loyal. Without pay, they turned on you. Rome's citizen-soldier model, expensive in the short term, requiring constant mobilization, was actually more stable. But Carthage couldn't change its system. Their citizen body was too small. They didn't have Rome's manpower reserves. Mercenaries were necessary, which meant they'd always be vulnerable. While Carthage was fighting for survival, Rome was expanding. They exploited Carthaginian weakness immediately. In 238 BCE, while Carthage was still dealing with the mercenary war, Rome seized Sardinia and Corsica. This was naked opportunism. The islands had been Carthaginian. The peace treaty hadn't included them. Rome just took them, knowing Carthage was too weak to respond. Carthage protested. Rome threatened renewed war if Carthage didn't accept the seizure. Carthage, barely recovered from the mercenary revolt, backed down, but this humiliation burned. It was one thing to lose Sicily in war, another to have territory stolen during a moment of weakness. Roman bad faith, violating the spirit, if not the letter of the peace treaty, created deep resentment. Hamilcar didn't forget. Neither did his family. Neither did Carthage's leadership. The peace was already poisoned. Rome was also expanding northward. The Po River Valley, Cisalpine Gaul, was inhabited by Celtic tribes. Fierce warriors, decentralized politically and increasingly pressured by Roman expansion. The Gauls had sacked Rome in 390 BCE, a national trauma Romans never forgot. Now Rome was pushing into Gallic territory, establishing colonies, building roads, projecting power. The Gauls resisted. This led to sporadic warfare throughout the 230s and 220s BCE. Rome won, mostly. The legions were effective against Celtic tribal armies, which relied on individual warrior courage rather than organized tactics. But the fighting was constant, and it gave Rome's legions continuous combat experience. Soldiers who'd fought in Sicily now fought in northern Italy. New generations of Romans learned warfare firsthand. By contrast, Carthage's military sat idle, no wars, no training. The institutional knowledge from the First Punic War was aging, retiring, dying without replacement. Rome was sharpening its military edge. Carthage was losing its edge through disuse. Hamilcar, meanwhile, had a plan. If Carthage had lost Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica, they'd need new wealth to replace it, new territories, new resources. Spain, Iberia. The peninsula was rich, silver mines, fertile land, tribal populations that could be recruited as soldiers. And it was far from Rome, far enough that Carthage could expand without immediate Roman interference. In 237 BCE, Hamilcar took an army to Spain. Not just soldiers, he brought his family. His sons, Hannibal, Hasdrubal, and Mago. The boys would grow up in military camps, learning warfare from childhood. Legend says that before leaving, Hamilcar made 9-year-old Hannibal swear an oath at an altar. Swear that he would never be a friend to Rome, that he would be Rome's enemy for life. Whether this happened exactly as described doesn't matter. What matters is the sentiment. Hamilcar was raising his sons to continue his war. The First Punic War had ended, but in Hamilcar's mind, the war against Rome never stopped. It just moved theatres. The conquest of Spain took years. Hamilcar fought Iberian tribes, established Carthaginian control, developed silver mines, and built a new power base independent of Carthage's political factions. He also created a hybrid military system. Carthaginian officers commanding armies that mixed mercenaries with Spanish tribal levies. The Spaniards were excellent infantry, tough, disciplined, equipped with deadly falcata swords. And they were loyal to their commanders, not to distant Carthage. This personal loyalty was crucial. Hamilcar was building an army that answered to him, not to Carthage's Senate. A private force funded by Spanish silver, trained by constant warfare against tribes, and commanded by his family. In 229 or 228 BCE, Hamilcar died, drowning while campaigning, the details unclear. His son-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, took command and continued the expansion. Hasdrubal founded New Carthage, Carthago Nova, modern Cartagena, as the capital of Carthaginian Spain. A planned city with fortifications, harbours, and administrative infrastructure. This wasn't just conquest. This was colonization. Permanent occupation. Building a new Carthaginian power centre in the west, Rome watched nervously. Carthaginian expansion in Spain was concerning, but not immediately threatening. Spain was far away, separated by the Pyrenees, by Gaul, by geography. In 226 BCE, Rome negotiated the Ebro Treaty with Hasdrubal. Carthage agreed not to expand north of the Ebro River. Roughly the northern third of Spain remained outside Carthaginian control. In exchange, Rome recognized Carthaginian dominance south of the Ebro. This seemed reasonable, a clear boundary, a way to avoid conflict, both sides expanding in different directions with a buffer zone between them. But treaties are only as good as the interests supporting them. And interests change. In 221 BCE, Hasdrubal was assassinated, killed by a Celtic slave with a personal grudge. Command passed to Hamilcar's eldest son, Hannibal Barca, 26 years old, raised in military camps, trained in warfare since childhood, carrying his father's grudge against Rome, and about to become the greatest tactical commander of the ancient world. Hannibal's appointment was popular with the army, but concerning to Carthage's Senate. He was young, aggressive, and commanded personal loyalty from soldiers who'd served under his father. That made him powerful. Potentially dangerous to political rivals back in Carthage. But he was also successful. Under his command, Carthaginian Spain was secure, profitable, and militarily strong. And Carthage needed success after the humiliations of losing Sicily, Sardinia, and Corsica. So they let him command, watched him carefully, and hoped he wouldn't start a war they couldn't control. That hope was misplaced. In 219 BCE, Hannibal besieged Saguntum, a city south of the Ebro but allied with Rome. Technically, this didn't violate the Ebro Treaty. Saguntum was in Carthaginian territory, but it was a Roman ally, which made the attack politically provocative. Rome protested, demanded Hannibal withdraw. Hannibal ignored them. The siege lasted 8 months. Saguntum's defenders fought desperately, knowing what awaited them if they fell. When the city finally collapsed, Hannibal's troops sacked it thoroughly. Survivors were enslaved or killed. Rome was furious. They sent ambassadors to Carthage demanding Hannibal be handed over for punishment. Carthage's Senate faced a choice: surrender their most successful general to appease Rome, or back him and risk war. They backed him, partly because Hannibal had powerful political supporters, partly because surrendering him would be humiliating, but mostly because they thought Rome wouldn't actually fight another war so soon after the last one. They were wrong. Rome declared war in 218 BCE. The Second Punic War had begun. But this time would be different. Rome expected to fight in Spain, maybe invade Africa again. A conventional war on familiar terms. Hannibal had other plans, plans that would bring Rome closer to destruction than it had ever been. Plans that would terrorize Italy for 16 years and teach Rome lessons about warfare it would never forget. But before those plans could unfold, Hannibal had to do something impossible, something no one expected, something that would change Mediterranean warfare forever. He had to get his army, infantry, cavalry, and war elephants over the Alps and into Italy, in winter, through hostile tribal territory, across mountains no army had ever crossed with a force this large, and then he had to win. Against a power that could raise legions faster than he could kill them. This should have been impossible, but Hannibal wasn't interested in what should be possible. He was interested in destroying Rome. Tonight, let that interval settle, the 23 years between wars. Rome expanding, gaining strength, sharpening its military, Carthage recovering, rebuilding, nurturing a grudge. Both sides had learned lessons from the First Punic War. Rome learned it could build a navy from nothing, could absorb catastrophic losses and keep fighting, could win through determination even when outmatched in skill. Carthage learned that traditional warfare, meeting Rome head-on with mercenary armies, didn't work. That Rome's manpower was effectively unlimited, that they needed a different approach. Hamilcar figured it out. His son perfected it, and Rome was about to discover just how devastating tactical genius combined with strategic surprise could be. The First Punic War was about Sicily, about control of an island, about resources and prestige. The Second Punic War would be about survival, about whether Rome would exist at all, about one man's tactical brilliance against an entire nation's capacity for suffering. The greatest war of the ancient world was about to begin, and it would reshape everything. It's spring, 218 BCE. Hannibal is in New Carthage, modern Cartagena, with an army of roughly 90,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 37 war elephants. He's 29 years old and about to attempt something that most generals would consider suicide. He's going to invade Italy. Not by sea. Rome controls the Mediterranean approaches and Carthage's navy is still rebuilding. By land. Through Spain, across southern Gaul, over the Alps, and into the Po Valley. No major army has ever crossed the Alps. The logistics are nightmarish. The tribes are hostile. Winter in the mountains kills unprepared travelers, and even if he succeeds, he'll be in enemy territory, surrounded by Roman allies, cut off from reinforcements and supply. It's brilliant. It's insane. And it's about to work, because Rome isn't expecting it. They've sent one consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, with an army to Spain to fight Hannibal there. Another consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, is preparing to invade Africa, again trying to strike at Carthage directly. Rome's strategy is to take the fight to enemy territory. Keep Italy safe, win the war abroad. Hannibal's strategy is simpler: bring the war to Rome's doorstep and break their confederation by convincing Italian allies to defect. The march through Spain took weeks. Hannibal moved north along the coast, securing his supply lines, subduing tribes that might threaten his rear, leaving garrisons to hold territory. He crossed the Pyrenees with about 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. Already he'd lost troops. Some killed fighting tribes, others left behind to garrison Spain. War elephants were slowly dying from the march's hardships, but the core army remained intact. Southern Gaul was politically fragmented. Some tribes opposed Carthaginian passage. Others were neutral. A few were hostile to Rome and willing to help. Hannibal negotiated, bribed, and fought his way through. At the Rhone River, he faced a major obstacle. The river was wide, swift, and the far bank was held by hostile Gauls who'd lined up to oppose the crossing. Hannibal sent a detachment upstream. They crossed secretly, circled behind the Gallic forces, and attacked their rear, while Hannibal's main force crossed the river in boats and rafts. The Gauls broke and fled, but getting elephants across the Rhone, that was harder. Elephants don't like water. They panic. Some accounts say Hannibal built massive rafts disguised with dirt to look like solid ground. The elephants walked onto them, didn't realize they were floating, and were towed across. Other accounts say handlers walked elephants into the water, kept their trunks above the surface like snorkels, and let them walk along the bottom. Either way, most elephants survived the crossing. The army was intact, and ahead lay the Alps. Which pass Hannibal used remains debated. Ancient sources are vague. Modern scholars argue endlessly about routes. The most likely candidates are the Col de Clapier or the Col de Montgenèvre, high mountain passes that would be treacherous even in good conditions. Hannibal began the climb in late October, already late in the season, already risky. The first days were difficult but manageable. Then they hit snow. Then, hostile alpine tribes began attacking the column, rolling boulders down slopes, ambushing the rear guard, stealing supplies. Hannibal fought them off but couldn't stop the attrition. Soldiers slipped on icy paths and plummeted into ravines. Pack animals lost footing and fell, taking supplies with them. Men froze at night. Food ran low. The elephants suffered worst. These were African elephants, adapted to warm climates, not alpine winters. They developed frostbite, went lame, died from exposure. Of the 37 that entered the Alps, only a handful survived. On the 9th day, they reached the summit. Hannibal gathered his army and pointed down into the Po Valley, Italy. The destination, the goal. According to the historian Livy, Hannibal told his troops, "You are now crossing not only the walls of Italy, but of Rome itself." Then came the descent, worse than the climb. Steep slopes, ice-covered paths, exhausted men barely able to control their descent. More fell, more died. After 15 days in the Alps, Hannibal emerged into the Po Valley. His army had been devastated. He'd entered with perhaps 50,000 infantry and 9,000 cavalry. He emerged with about 20,000 infantry, mostly African and Spanish veterans, and 6,000 cavalry. 2/3 of his army was gone, but the remainder were hardened survivors. And he was in Italy. Rome had no idea he was coming. The consul Publius Cornelius Scipio had sailed to Spain, but learned Hannibal had already left. He sent most of his army to Spain under his brother's command, then rushed back to northern Italy with a small force. He encountered Hannibal's cavalry at the Ticinus River in November 218 BCE. This wasn't a major battle, just a skirmish, a cavalry engagement. But it revealed something crucial. Carthaginian cavalry was superior. Numidian light cavalry, mobile, skilled with javelins, masters of feigned retreats and encirclement, dominated Roman horsemen who fought in tight formations with limited mobility. Scipio was wounded in the skirmish. His son, also named Publius Cornelius Scipio, later called Scipio Africanus, who'd eventually defeat Hannibal, allegedly saved his father's life by charging into the melee. Scipio withdrew. He knew he was outnumbered and outmatched. He waited for the other consul, Sempronius Longus, to arrive with reinforcements. Sempronius arrived in December with a fresh army. He was eager for battle. Consulships were annual, and he wanted a victory before his term ended. Glory, prestige, and a triumph waited for the consul who defeated Carthage's invading army. Hannibal understood this, understood Roman political pressures, understood that Sempronius needed a battle and could be baited into one. Near the Trebia River, Hannibal set a trap. He sent Numidian cavalry across the river early in the morning to harass the Roman camp. Sempronius, as expected, ordered his entire army to cross the river and engage. It was winter. The water was freezing. Roman soldiers waded across chest deep, their weapons and armor soaked, their bodies numb from cold. They hadn't eaten breakfast. The attack came too early. On the far bank, Hannibal's army waited, rested, fed, warmed by fires. And hidden in the brush along the river was Hannibal's brother Mago with 2,000 elite infantry and cavalry. The armies clashed. Roman legions fought well initially. Their infantry was disciplined, experienced, and for a while they held their ground against Hannibal's center. But Carthaginian cavalry swept around the Roman flanks, and then Mago's hidden force attacked from behind. The Roman army was surrounded, pinned from all sides. Panicking soldiers broke ranks, some fled. Many were cut down. About 10,000 Romans managed to cut through Hannibal's center and escape, ironically proving that Roman infantry, even in desperate circumstances, was formidable. But the rest, killed or captured, perhaps 30,000 casualties. Sempronius escaped with the survivors and retreated. His reputation was ruined. But the larger issue was strategic. Hannibal had won his first major battle in Italy. Decisively. Rome panicked. An enemy army was in Italy. Their legions had been defeated. The invasion route everyone thought impossible had been achieved. The Senate raised new legions. Appointed new consuls for 217 BCE, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Mobilized allies. Called up reserves. Rome's manpower advantage was showing itself. Lose an army, raise another. Lose that one, raise two more. Rome's confederation system meant they could draw on the populations of allied Italian cities, Latins, Samnites, Etruscans, Greeks in the south. Hannibal had a strategic problem. He'd won a battle, but couldn't win a war of attrition. His army was finite. Reinforcements from Spain or Africa had to cross hostile territory or Roman-controlled seas. Every casualty was irreplaceable. His solution: convince Rome's Italian allies to defect, break the Confederation, isolate Rome politically so its manpower advantage evaporated. He announced he wasn't at war with Rome's allies, only with Rome itself. Cities that defected would be treated well. Those that stayed loyal to Rome would be destroyed. This was psychological warfare. Hannibal was attacking Rome's strategic foundation, the loyalty of its confederation. In spring 217 BCE, Hannibal marched south through central Italy. The consul Flaminius shadowed him with an army but avoided battle, waiting for his co-consul Servilius to arrive with reinforcements. Hannibal needed to force a battle before Roman armies could concentrate, so he set another trap. At Lake Trasimene, a large lake in modern Tuscany, the road ran along the northern shore between the water and steep hills. Hannibal marched his army through this defile, then doubled back at night and hid his troops in the hills above the road. Flaminius followed the next morning. His army marched in column along the lakeshore, strung out, vulnerable, not in battle formation. Hannibal attacked from the hills. The entire Carthaginian army swept down simultaneously, hitting the Roman column along its entire length. The Romans had no time to form up. No space to maneuver, lake on one side, enemies pouring down from the other. The fog was thick that morning, reducing visibility to yards. It was slaughter. Not a battle, an ambush. Roman soldiers were driven into the lake and drowned. Cut down while trying to form ranks, surrounded and killed in isolated groups. Flaminius died fighting. About 15,000 Romans were killed. Another 15,000 captured, only a few thousand escaped. 2 Roman armies destroyed in 6 months. Rome's military prestige was shattered. Rome appointed a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus. In the Roman system, a dictator was a temporary position during emergencies, granted absolute authority for 6 months. Fabius understood something crucial: Rome couldn't beat Hannibal in open battle. His tactical genius, his superior cavalry, his ability to choose when and where to fight, these gave him overwhelming advantages. So Fabius refused to fight. He shadowed Hannibal's army but avoided engagement. Harassed foragers, cut off stragglers, denied Hannibal the decisive battle he needed. This strategy, called Fabian strategy ever since, was frustrating. Humiliating even. Romans wanted revenge. Wanted to prove they could beat Carthage. Fabius's caution looked like cowardice. But it was working. Hannibal couldn't force battle if Romans refused to engage. His army consumed supplies but couldn't resupply easily. Italian allies weren't defecting en masse as he'd hoped. Most stayed loyal to Rome, intimidated by Roman threats, or unconvinced Hannibal could win. Fabius's dictatorship ended after 6 months. New consuls took command in 216 BCE, Lucius Aemilius Paulus and Gaius Terentius Varro. The Senate authorized them to raise the largest army Rome had ever fielded. 8 legions, roughly 80,000 infantry, plus allied contingents bringing the total to nearly 87,000 men. They would find Hannibal. They would force battle. They would end this invasion decisively. This was exactly what Hannibal wanted. The armies met at Cannae in August 216 BCE, a small town in Apulia, southeastern Italy. Flat terrain, perfect for cavalry. Terrible for Rome's infantry-focused army. Hannibal had about 40,000 infantry and 10,000 cavalry, outnumbered nearly 2-to-1 in infantry, roughly equal in cavalry. The consuls deployed their army in traditional fashion, infantry in the center, cavalry on the wings. But they made the formation deeper than usual, 50 ranks deep instead of the normal 10. They wanted overwhelming force in the center to smash through Hannibal's line. Hannibal deployed differently. His infantry formed a crescent, bulging forward in the center where he placed his weakest troops, Gauls and Spaniards. His best infantry, African veterans, were on the flanks, slightly behind the line. His cavalry was on the wings. The battle began with cavalry engagements. On the Roman right, Carthaginian heavy cavalry, led by Hannibal's brother Hasdrubal, charged Roman cavalry and drove them from the field. On the Roman left, Numidian light cavalry skirmished with allied cavalry, keeping them occupied but not decisively engaged. In the center, the Roman infantry advanced. Hit Hannibal's line, started pushing it back. The crescent began bending inward under pressure. This was working. Roman soldiers pushed forward. The Carthaginian center was collapsing. Victory seemed close, except it wasn't collapsing. It was retreating deliberately, drawing Romans deeper. The crescent was now concave, curving inward with Romans in the pocket. And then Hannibal sprung the trap. The African infantry on the flanks wheeled inward, hitting the Roman sides. Simultaneously, Hasdrubal's cavalry, having routed the Roman right, rode behind the Roman army and hit them from behind. The Romans were surrounded, packed so tightly that soldiers in the rear ranks couldn't fight, couldn't even move. The mass of bodies became a killing box. Hannibal's forces pressed inward from all sides. Roman soldiers couldn't maneuver, couldn't retreat, couldn't do anything but die. The slaughter continued for hours. When it ended, approximately 50,000 to 70,000 Romans were dead. The consul Paulus was killed. Varro escaped with perhaps 15,000 survivors. Cannae was the worst military defeat in Roman history. One of the worst defeats any army has ever suffered. An entire generation of Roman aristocracy died that day, senators' sons, wealthy equestrians, the political and military elite. Rome had lost 3 armies in 2 years. The path to Rome itself was open. Hannibal could march on the city, besiege it, potentially end the war. His officers urged him to do exactly that, strike now while Rome was reeling. Hannibal refused. He knew Rome's walls were strong. He lacked siege equipment. His army was exhausted. And even now, even after Cannae, Rome was raising new legions. Instead, he continued his strategy, pressure Rome's allies to defect. Without the Confederation, Rome was just one city. And it started working. Capua, the second largest city in Italy, defected to Hannibal. So did several southern Italian cities. Syracuse in Sicily revolted against Roman control. Philip V of Macedon allied with Carthage, threatening Roman interests in Greece. Rome's strategic situation looked catastrophic. Hannibal in Italy, allies defecting, multiple fronts opening. The war seemed lost. But Rome didn't surrender, didn't negotiate, didn't even consider peace. The Senate voted to continue the war. They raised new legions from men previously considered too young, too old, or too poor to serve. They freed slaves and armed them. 8,000 slaves bought their freedom by enlisting. They fortified cities, strengthened alliances with remaining loyal communities, and they adopted Fabian strategy permanently, refused to fight Hannibal directly, shadow him, harass him, deny him decisive battles, meanwhile attack everywhere else. Send armies to Spain to cut off Carthaginian reinforcements, send fleets to Sicily. Pressure Macedon, make Carthage fight on multiple fronts. This was strategic insight. Rome couldn't beat Hannibal, but they could outlast him. Wear him down, slowly strangle his logistics while rebuilding their own strength. It would take years. Over a decade, but it would work. Tonight, let that settle. Cannae, the perfect tactical victory. A smaller army destroying a larger one through superior positioning, timing, and cavalry dominance. A masterpiece of battlefield maneuver that military academies still study. But also Cannae, the strategic failure, because despite the victory, despite 70,000 Romans dead, despite Italian allies defecting, Hannibal couldn't win the war. Rome's confederation held, mostly. Enough cities stayed loyal, enough manpower remained available. And Rome's stubborn refusal to quit, their willingness to arm slaves and children and old men rather than surrender, meant Hannibal faced an enemy that couldn't be broken. He'd won the greatest tactical victory in military history. And it wasn't enough. The war was far from over. Hannibal would remain in Italy for 13 more years, fighting, winning battles, slowly running out of resources, reinforcements, and options. Rome would learn, adapt, transform from a republic that fought traditional wars into a strategic empire that thought in terms of decades and theatres and resources. Cannae taught Rome that courage wasn't enough, that discipline wasn't enough, that even superior numbers weren't enough. They needed strategy, logistics, patience, and the willingness to lose battles while winning wars. These lessons would define Roman military doctrine for centuries, and they'd learned them from the best teacher possible: defeat. Hannibal was winning battles, but battles weren't enough. After Cannae, he'd spent months consolidating gains, securing defected cities, negotiating with potential allies, waiting for reinforcements from Carthage or Spain that never came. The strategic situation was deteriorating. Rome controlled the seas, blockading Carthaginian ports and intercepting supply ships. Hannibal's army in Italy was isolated, winning ground battles but slowly starving logistically. He couldn't besiege Rome itself. The city's walls, the Servian walls we discussed in the architecture script, were too strong, and Hannibal lacked siege equipment. Bringing up siege towers, battering rams, and the infrastructure needed for a prolonged siege was impossible without naval support. So Hannibal remained in southern Italy, holding territory, raiding, winning skirmishes, but not winning the war. Rome, meanwhile, was adapting. They'd learned their lesson. No more massive set-piece battles against Hannibal. Instead, Fabian strategy. Shadow him, harass his supply lines, recapture defected cities when he's not there to defend them, and crucially, attack Carthaginian holdings elsewhere. Spain, Sicily, Africa. Make Carthage fight on multiple fronts so they can't reinforce Hannibal. The war in Spain was critical. Carthage's Spanish territories provided silver, manpower, and the staging ground for potential reinforcements to Italy. Rome sent the Scipio brothers, Publius and Gnaeus Cornelius Scipio, with armies to contest Carthaginian control. They had some success, captured Saguntum, pushed Carthaginian forces south, disrupted the supply chain. But in 211 BCE, both Scipio brothers were killed in separate battles against Carthaginian armies commanded by Hasdrubal Barca, Hannibal's brother, and Mago Barca, another brother. Rome's Spanish campaign collapsed. The Senate needed a new commander, someone capable, experienced, and willing to take the assignment after two consular generals had just been killed. They chose young Publius Cornelius Scipio, son of the dead consul, nephew of the other. He was 25 years old, technically too young for the command. But he'd survived Cannae, had saved his father at Ticinus, and had a reputation for tactical intelligence. The Senate gave him proconsular imperium, essentially emergency military authority, and sent him to Spain. It was the best decision they made during the entire war. Scipio arrived in Spain in 210 BCE and immediately did something unexpected. Instead of cautiously rebuilding Roman strength, he attacked. Specifically, he attacked New Carthage, Carthago Nova, Carthage's Spanish capital, the city where Hannibal had begun his march to Italy, the administrative, economic, and symbolic heart of Carthaginian Spain. It was defended by a small garrison. Most Carthaginian armies were elsewhere fighting tribal revolts. Scipio besieged it in 209 BCE with about 25,000 infantry and 2,500 cavalry. The city's defences were formidable. Walls, a citadel, and a lagoon on one side that seemed to make assault impossible. But Scipio learned, through reconnaissance and local informants, that the lagoon was shallow at low tide. He timed his assault, attacked the main walls with ladders, while simultaneously sending 500 men wading across the lagoon at low tide. They scaled the undefended walls. Nobody expected an attack from that direction, opened the gates from inside, and the city fell in a day. Scipio captured enormous supplies, silver, weapons, ships, and hostages, Spanish nobles whose tribes had allied with Carthage. He treated the hostages well, released many without ransom, and began diplomatic efforts to flip Spanish tribes to Rome's side. This was strategic sophistication. Scipio understood that Spain wasn't just a military problem. It was political. Carthage controlled Spain through alliances with local tribes. Break those alliances and Carthaginian power collapsed. Over the next 3 years, Scipio systematically dismantled Carthaginian control of Spain. He fought battles, defeating Hasdrubal Barca at Becula in 208 BCE, but also negotiated, bribed and convinced tribes to switch sides. Hasdrubal, recognizing Spain was lost, made a desperate decision. He'd take his army, roughly 20,000 men, across the Alps into Italy to reinforce Hannibal. This was what Rome feared most. Hannibal, supplied and reinforced, could threaten Rome directly again. Hasdrubal crossed the Alps in 207 BCE, using the same route his brother had, but in better conditions with a smaller force. He emerged in northern Italy and sent messengers to Hannibal in the south, coordinating a meeting point where their armies could unite. Rome intercepted the messengers. They knew Hasdrubal's plans, knew where he was heading, and made a critical strategic decision. Two consuls, Marcus Livius Salinator and Gaius Claudius Nero, commanded separate armies. Livius was shadowing Hasdrubal in the north. Nero was watching Hannibal in the south. Nero did something audacious. He took 7,000 elite troops, marched them 240 miles north in 7 days, and reinforced Livius's army, leaving just enough troops in the south to make Hannibal think the full army was still there. The combined Roman force met Hasdrubal at the Metaurus River in June 207 BCE. Hasdrubal had perhaps 30,000 troops, his Spanish veterans plus Gallic recruits picked up in northern Italy. The Romans had roughly 40,000 with Nero's reinforcements. Hasdrubal tried to avoid battle. He knew he was outnumbered and needed to link up with Hannibal. But the Romans forced the engagement. The battle was brutal. Hasdrubal's Spanish infantry fought well. His Gallic recruits, less so, many broke under pressure. And Nero, commanding the Roman right wing, did something tactically brilliant. His wing was stalled against difficult terrain, unable to advance. Rather than sit idle, Nero pulled his troops out of line, marched them behind the Roman formation, and hit Hasdrubal's left flank from behind. This encirclement collapsed Carthaginian resistance. Hasdrubal, seeing the battle lost, charged into the Roman lines and died fighting. His army was destroyed, perhaps 10,000 killed, the rest scattered. Rome had won a decisive victory. The reinforcements Hannibal desperately needed were gone. And Nero sent Hasdrubal's severed head south. Had it thrown into Hannibal's camp. A message, your brother is dead. No help is coming. You're alone. Hannibal understood. He'd been in Italy for 11 years, winning battles but not the war. And now, with Spain lost and reinforcements destroyed, his strategic position was hopeless. He retreated to the far south of Italy, Bruttium, the toe of the boot. Held territory there. Waited. Hoped Carthage would send support. They didn't. Carthage's government was divided. Some factions wanted to reinforce Hannibal. Others wanted to negotiate peace. Still others pursued their own political agendas. The institutional paralysis that had weakened Carthage in the First Punic War was back. Meanwhile, Rome was recapturing defected cities. Capua fell in 211 BCE after a brutal siege. The city was punished savagely, its leaders executed, its population enslaved or scattered. A message to other cities considering defection: Rome forgives nothing. Syracuse fell in 212 BCE after a 2-year siege. The brilliant engineer Archimedes, who'd designed defensive siege weapons that had delayed Roman assault, was killed when the city was sacked. Roman soldiers didn't know who he was. Just another old man in a conquered city. One by one, Rome reclaimed Italy. Hannibal couldn't defend everywhere. His army was too small, his resources too limited. He watched his conquests evaporate, powerless to stop it. By 205 BCE, Rome was ready for the final phase. They'd contained Hannibal, reclaimed most of Italy, conquered Spain. Now they'd strike at Carthage itself. Scipio, now called Scipio Africanus, though he hadn't earned that cognomen yet, proposed invading Africa, forcing Carthage to recall Hannibal to defend their homeland. The Senate was divided. Many senators distrusted Scipio. He was young, popular with soldiers, dangerously competent. Giving him an army to invade Africa made him even more powerful. But the strategic logic was sound. They couldn't defeat Hannibal in Italy, he was too good a general. But they could force him to leave by threatening Carthage. Scipio got his invasion. though the Senate, in typical political fashion, gave him limited resources. He'd have to raise troops through volunteers and by recruiting from Sicily. He raised 2 legions, including veterans from Cannae who'd been exiled to Sicily, considered disgraced and eager to redeem themselves. He trained them relentlessly, drilled them in new tactics he'd developed fighting in Spain. And in 204 BCE, he invaded Africa. Scipio landed near Utica, not far from Carthage. His army, roughly 30,000 men, was smaller than the forces Carthage could field. But Scipio had learned from Hannibal, learned about mobility, deception, choosing battlefields carefully. Carthage fielded 2 armies. One Carthaginian, commanded by Hasdrubal Gisco, not Hannibal's brother, different Hasdrubal. Another Numidian, commanded by King Syphax, who'd allied with Carthage. The armies camped separately, near each other, but not united. Scipio negotiated with them, pretended to discuss peace terms. Sent envoys who were actually intelligence officers studying the camp's layouts and defences. Then, at night, Scipio attacked both camps simultaneously, set them on fire, slaughtered soldiers as they fled the flames. It was devastation, perhaps 40,000 Carthaginians and Numidians killed or captured. Carthage panicked. They recalled Hannibal from Italy. Hannibal left Italy in 203 BCE, 15 years after arriving. He'd never been defeated in a major battle there, never lost a siege he personally commanded, never stopped being a threat. But he'd lost the war, because wars aren't decided by battles alone. They're decided by resources, logistics, alliances, and strategic patience. Rome had more of everything. More men, more cities, more resilience. They'd absorbed losses that would have destroyed other nations and kept fighting. Hannibal returned to Carthage a legend, the general who'd humiliated Rome, who'd killed more Roman soldiers than any other commander in history, who'd held Italy for over a decade. But he was also a failure, because Carthage was now facing invasion. And everything he'd fought for in Italy, breaking Rome's confederation, forcing a favourable peace, had failed. Now he'd face Scipio, the young Roman general who'd learned everything Hannibal had taught, who'd studied his tactics, understood his strategies, and was about to use them against him. The 2 greatest generals of the age would meet in Africa, in a battle that would decide the war, and one of them would lose for the first time. Tonight, let that long middle war settle. 13 years of stalemate. Hannibal stranded in Italy, winning battles but watching his strategic position erode. Rome learning that they couldn't beat him directly but could outlast him. This is the unglamorous reality of warfare, not glorious charges and heroic last stands, but logistics, supply lines, political will, the grinding attrition that breaks armies slowly. Hannibal was a tactical genius, possibly the greatest battlefield commander who ever lived. And it wasn't enough, because Rome had something he didn't: depth, reserves, the ability to lose and keep fighting. They'd learned from every defeat, adapted their tactics, refused to give up. And slowly, methodically, they'd won, not by beating Hannibal, but by making it impossible for him to win. The final battle is coming. The confrontation everyone knew was inevitable from the moment Scipio landed in Africa. But the outcome, strategically, was already decided. Hannibal had lost when he couldn't break Rome after Cannae. Everything since was just playing out the consequences. Now he'd face that truth on the battlefield, against a Roman who'd learned from him, who respected him, and who was about to prove that the student had surpassed the master. It's October 202 BCE, and 2 armies face each other on the plain of Zama, roughly 5 days' march southwest of Carthage. On one side, Hannibal Barca, 54 years old, undefeated in major battles for his entire career. The man who crossed the Alps, destroyed 3 Roman armies, killed more Roman soldiers than any general in history, leading roughly 36,000 infantry, 4,000 cavalry, and 80 war elephants. On the other side, Publius Cornelius Scipio Africanus, 33 years old, survivor of Cannae, conqueror of Spain, commander of roughly 29,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, including Numidian horsemen who'd switched sides to support Rome. The cavalry numbers are crucial. Hannibal's career was built on cavalry superiority. At Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, his cavalry had always outnumbered and outfought Roman horsemen, allowing him to encircle infantry. Now Scipio had the cavalry advantage, and he'd learned how to use it. Before the battle, the two generals met, face to face, alone except for interpreters. Ancient sources record a conversation, probably embellished, possibly invented, but thematically important. Hannibal allegedly offered peace terms. Carthage would abandon all claims outside Africa, pay indemnities, recognize Roman supremacy. Scipio refused. The terms weren't harsh enough. Rome had been fighting for 17 years. They'd lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers. They wanted unconditional victory, not negotiated peace. Hannibal reportedly said something like, "I see you won't be satisfied with anything less than total victory. Very well. Let battle decide," and they returned to their armies. Whether this conversation happened exactly as recorded doesn't matter. What matters is the strategic reality. Both men knew this battle would end the war. One way or another, Hannibal deployed his army in 3 lines, an unusual formation for him. First line, war elephants and light infantry. About 80 elephants, more than he'd ever commanded before, though many were young and poorly trained. African elephants, not the larger Indian species. Behind them, light infantry, Ligurians and Gauls, expendable troops meant to absorb the initial Roman assault. Second line, Carthaginian citizen infantry and Libyan troops. Solid soldiers, but not Hannibal's best. Third line, held in reserve, Hannibal's veterans from Italy, the Bruttian survivors. Men who'd fought at Trebia, Trasimene, Cannae. His most experienced, most disciplined, most dangerous soldiers. This 3-line deployment was defensive. Hannibal planned to weather the Roman assault, wear them down through the first 2 lines, then crush them with his veteran reserve. His cavalry, outnumbered, was on the wings. He knew they'd lose the cavalry battle. The plan was to hold them off long enough for the infantry to win in the center. Scipio deployed differently. He'd learned from Hannibal's tactics and understood the threat elephants posed. His legions formed in the standard 3-line Roman formation, Hastati in front, Principes behind them, Triarii in reserve. But with a crucial modification. Instead of a continuous line, the maniples, small unit formations, were arranged in columns with gaps between them. Lanes. Corridors running through the entire formation from front to back. Light infantry, velites, were positioned in front with orders to harass the elephants, then retreat through the lanes when the elephants charged. Scipio's cavalry, Numidian horsemen under Massinissa on the right, Roman and Italian cavalry under Laelius on the left, waited on the wings. The plan was simple: let the elephants charge through the lanes without disrupting the formation. Win the cavalry battle, then destroy Hannibal's infantry with superior numbers and encirclement. Scipio was using Hannibal's own tactics against him. The battle began with the elephant charge. Hannibal ordered them forward, trumpets blaring, mahouts driving them toward Roman lines. Some elephants charged straight ahead. Roman velites threw javelins, wounded them, drove them into the lanes where they passed through the formation harmlessly. Other elephants, spooked by the noise and missile fire, panicked and turned back, trampling Carthaginian cavalry on the left wing. The elephant charge, Hannibal's opening gambit, failed. Most elephants were driven off, killed, or caused more damage to Carthaginian forces than Roman. This was a lesson in combined arms. Elephants are powerful but not invincible. Disciplined infantry with space to maneuver can neutralize them. Scipio had created that space deliberately. The cavalry battle erupted on both flanks simultaneously. Massinissa's Numidians attacked Carthaginian cavalry on the right. Laelius's Roman cavalry hit them on the left. Carthaginian horsemen, already disrupted by panicked elephants, broke quickly. They fled the field, pursued by Roman and Numidian cavalry. Now Hannibal's infantry was alone. No cavalry support, no elephants. Facing Roman legions in open battle. His first line, light infantry, advanced and engaged. They fought briefly, suffered heavy casualties, then retreated through the second line. Standard tactic. Use expendable troops to tire the enemy, then bring in better soldiers. Hannibal's second line, Carthaginian citizens and Libyans, advanced. They clashed with the Roman hastati and principes. Hard fighting. Close quarters. Swords and shields, shoving and stabbing. The second line held longer, but eventually buckled under Roman pressure. They tried to retreat to the third line, join Hannibal's veterans, consolidate forces. Hannibal refused to let them. He ordered his veterans to bar the second line's retreat. Keep them out. Let them be destroyed. This sounds cruel. It was tactically necessary. If the retreating, demoralized second line joined the veteran third line, they'd disrupt formation, spread panic, weaken the only force Hannibal had left. Better to sacrifice them. Keep the veterans intact, fight the final phase with only reliable troops. The Roman legions stopped to reform. They'd broken through two lines but were tired, disordered, bloodied. Scipio recalled them, reorganized the formation, and prepared for the final assault. Across a field littered with bodies, Hannibal's veterans waited. About 12,000 men, the survivors of 15 years in Italy. Men who'd never lost a battle. This was the moment Hannibal had been waiting for. His best troops rested against tired Romans. If he could break them here, if his veterans could do what they'd always done, hold the line, grind down the enemy, he might still win. But his cavalry was gone. Scattered across the African plain, chased by Numidians and Romans who'd return soon. The two infantry forces clashed. The Romans had numerical superiority, perhaps 24,000 infantry against 12,000 Carthaginians. But Hannibal's veterans were elite, experienced, disciplined. The lines met, pushed, fought. Neither side breaking. Roman numbers versus Carthaginian skill and experience. For a while, it was even. The veterans held. Hannibal, fighting in the front ranks, he always fought with his men, kept the line together through personal presence and tactical adjustments. But then the Roman and Numidian cavalry returned. They'd chased Carthaginian horsemen off the field, then wheeled around and returned to the battle, exactly as Scipio had planned. Exactly as Hannibal had done at Cannae, they hit Hannibal's veterans from behind. Encirclement. The tactic Hannibal had perfected, now used against him. The Carthaginian line collapsed. Surrounded, outnumbered, attacked from all sides, even veterans couldn't hold. The formation broke. Men scattered. Some tried to flee. Most were cut down. Perhaps 20,000 Carthaginians died at Zama. Hannibal escaped with a few thousand survivors. His veterans, the men who'd crossed the Alps, who'd won at Cannae, were gone. Roman casualties were perhaps 2,500. Light compared to their previous battles against Hannibal, Scipio had won, decisively, using Hannibal's own tactics, adapted and improved against the master himself. Hannibal returned to Carthage, advised the Senate to accept peace. There was no path to victory, no resources to continue. Rome had won, Carthage negotiated. The peace terms were harsh but not annihilating, not yet. Carthage would pay 10,000 talents over 50 years, crippling but manageable, surrender all but 10 warships, destroying their naval power, abandon all territory outside Africa. Agree never to wage war without Roman permission. They were allowed to exist, allowed to govern their African territories. But they were no longer an independent power. They were a Roman client, surviving at Rome's pleasure. Hannibal stayed in Carthage, became a civilian administrator, reformed the government, fought corruption, tried to make Carthage prosperous within its new limitations. But Rome didn't trust him, didn't forgive him. Roman senators, particularly Cato the Elder, saw his continued existence as a threat. In 195 BCE, Rome demanded Carthage hand over Hannibal. He fled. Spent years in exile, serving various kings and states as a military advisor, always moving, always one step ahead of Roman agents. He ended up in Bithynia, in modern Turkey, around 183 BCE. Roman agents found him. Rather than be captured, he took poison, died on his own terms. His last words, allegedly, "Let us relieve the Romans from the anxiety they have so long experienced, since they think it tries their patience too much to wait for an old man's death." Defiant to the end. Bitter, unbroken, even in defeat. Let's talk about what Zama taught, because this battle is studied in military academies for good reason. First, cavalry matters. Hannibal built his career on cavalry superiority. When Scipio achieved cavalry advantage through diplomacy with Numidian kings, through better logistics, through strategy, Hannibal's tactical options collapsed. Infantry, however skilled, can't win if they're encircled by cavalry. Combined arms, infantry, cavalry, light troops working together, beats even elite infantry fighting alone. Second, adaptation beats brilliance. Hannibal was the better tactical mind, more experienced, more innovative. But Scipio adapted. He learned from defeats, studied Hannibal's methods, and applied them with Roman resources and discipline. This is the Roman genius. Not tactical innovation, they were rarely the most creative on battlefields, but systematic learning, institutional adaptation, turning defeats into lessons and losses into training. Third, logistics and strategy trump tactics. Hannibal won almost every battle. It didn't matter. Rome's strategic patience, their logistical superiority, their ability to fight on multiple fronts, these decided the war. Zama was decisive tactically. But strategically, it just confirmed what the previous 5 years had already determined. Rome had won by refusing to lose. The Second Punic War transformed Rome. They'd entered it as a regional Italian power. They emerged as the dominant Mediterranean force. They'd learned to fight across multiple theatres, learned logistics on unprecedented scales, learned that tactical defeats didn't mean strategic failure, learned patience, and they'd learned that total victory was possible, that enemies could be crushed so completely they'd never threaten Rome again. This lesson would shape Roman imperial policy for centuries. No more negotiated peaces, no more powerful rivals. From now on, Rome's wars would end in one of two ways: complete submission or complete destruction. Carthage had taught Rome how to be an empire. Now they'd discover the empire they'd created had no place for them. Tonight, let Zama settle. The greatest battle of the Second Punic War. The tactical genius defeated by his own tactics. The student surpassing the master. Scipio used everything Hannibal had taught Rome through 17 years of defeats through Trebia and Trasimene and Cannae. Used cavalry encirclement. Used deception, used mobility and timing. And he won. Not because he was better than Hannibal, he probably wasn't. But because he had more resources, better logistics, and Roman institutional support that allowed him to concentrate force at the decisive point. Hannibal fought alone. Scipio fought with an empire behind him. That made all the difference. The Second Punic War was over. Rome had survived its greatest threat. Hannibal, undefeated for decades, had finally lost. But Carthage remained, broken, humiliated, but still existing. Still a city, still a potential threat, however theoretical, to Roman dominance. Some Romans would never forget what Hannibal had done, would never forgive, would never feel safe while Carthage existed. And those Romans would eventually get their way. The Second Punic War ended in 201 BCE. For the next 50 years, there was peace. Technically, Carthage paid its indemnities, rebuilt its economy within the restrictions Rome imposed, focused on trade, what they'd always been good at. The African territories still generated wealth. Not empire-level wealth, but enough to survive, even prosper modestly. Hannibal, before his exile, reformed Carthaginian government, reduced corruption, improved tax collection, made the payments to Rome sustainable without destroying the economy. Carthage was recovering. Not as a military power, their fleet was limited to 10 ships, their army restricted. But as a commercial entity, a trading city, what they'd been centuries before the wars. Rome watched, suspiciously, always suspiciously. Because here's the thing about Carthage, even broken, even restricted, even compliant with every treaty obligation, they were still rich. Still economically vibrant, still a city of hundreds of thousands, with harbours and trade networks and the potential, however theoretical, to rebuild. And some Romans couldn't accept that. Marcus Porcius Cato the Elder, Cato the Censor, became Carthage's most vocal enemy in the Roman Senate. Cato had fought in the Second Punic War, served in Sicily and Africa, seen what Carthaginian wealth could build, what their military could do when properly resourced. He didn't trust the peace, didn't believe Carthage had truly been defeated, and he ended every speech in the Senate, regardless of topic, with the phrase Carthago delenda est. Carthage must be destroyed. Discussing agricultural policy, Carthage must be destroyed. Debating tax reforms, Carthage must be destroyed. Arguing about public works, Carthage must be destroyed. It became his signature, his obsession, and slowly he convinced others. The argument was strategic. Carthage, even restricted, was recovering economically. Their population was growing. Their trade was expanding. Give them another generation, and they might threaten Rome again. Better to eliminate the threat permanently. While Carthage was still weak, while Rome was strong, finish what they'd started. But there was a problem. Carthage wasn't violating the treaty. They paid indemnities on time. They hadn't rebuilt their military beyond permitted levels. They hadn't waged war. They'd asked Roman permission for minor defensive actions against Numidian raids, as the treaty required. Rome needed a pretext, a justification that wouldn't make them look like aggressors destroying a compliant, peaceful state. Numidia provided it. Massinissa, the Numidian king who'd allied with Scipio at Zama, had been rewarded with territory and Roman support. His kingdom bordered Carthaginian Africa, and for decades he'd been encroaching on Carthaginian land. Raids, border disputes, gradual territorial expansion. Carthage protested to Rome repeatedly. Rome ignored them or ruled in Massinissa's favour. Carthage was trapped. The treaty forbade them from waging war without Roman permission. But Rome wouldn't give permission to defend against Numidian aggression, so they lost territory. Slowly, incrementally, legal theft backed by Roman power. By 151 BCE, Massinissa controlled significant Carthaginian territory. Carthage's economy was being strangled, their patience exhausted. They raised an army without Roman permission and attacked Numidian forces. Rome had its pretext. The Senate declared war in 149 BCE. The Third Punic War had begun. Rome sent an army to Africa, roughly 80,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry, under consul Manius Manilius, with Scipio Aemilianus, adoptive grandson of Scipio Africanus, serving as military tribune. The Roman demands were presented to Carthage: submit completely, hand over 300 noble children as hostages, surrender all weapons and armour. Carthage complied. They sent the hostages. They surrendered weapons, 200,000 sets of arms and armour, 2,000 catapults. Everything. Then Rome presented the final demand: abandon your city. Evacuate Carthage completely. Rebuild at least 10 miles from the coast. This was annihilation. Carthage's power was its harbour, its position on trade routes, its access to the sea. Move inland, and the city was nothing. The economy would collapse. The population would disperse. Carthage would cease to exist as anything meaningful. The Carthaginian delegates returned home with these terms. The Senate debated briefly, then decided no. If Rome wants Carthage destroyed, they'll have to do it by force. The city mobilized for total war. This wasn't a military campaign or territorial dispute. This was survival. Carthage had no weapons, they'd surrendered everything. So they manufactured new ones. Forges worked day and night. Citizens donated metal, jewelry, household items, anything that could be melted down. Women cut their hair to make ropes for catapults. Siege weapons required twisted fibers for torsion springs, and hair worked when rope wasn't available. Within weeks, Carthage had rearmed. Not to pre-war levels, but enough to defend. They raised an army of 30,000 from citizens, not mercenaries this time, but Carthaginians fighting for their own survival. And they prepared the city for siege. Stockpiled food. Reinforced walls. Organized defenses. Hasdrubal, not Hannibal's brother, another general with the same common Carthaginian name, took command of the army and the defense. The Roman siege began in 149 BCE. It should have been quick. Rome had overwhelming force. Carthage was isolated, outnumbered, cut off from external support. But Carthage's defences were formidable. Triple walls on the landward side, the ones we mentioned in Chapter 1, over 40 feet tall, 6 stories in some sections. The walls had internal barracks, stables, armories. Defenders could live inside them. The harbour fortifications were equally strong. And Carthage had a secret. They'd built a new fleet. In the circular military harbour, the Kothon, hidden from external view, they'd constructed 50 new warships. When Roman ships approached to blockade the harbour, Carthaginian ships emerged and engaged them. The naval battle was indecisive, but it demonstrated that Carthage still had fight left. The siege dragged on. Months became a year. Roman assaults failed. Disease spread in the Roman camps. Supplies ran low. Maintaining an army of 80,000 besieging a well-defended city required massive logistics. In 148 BCE, Scipio Aemilianus was elected consul. Technically he was too young, but Rome bent the rules and given command of the siege. He changed tactics. No more direct assaults. Instead, blockade. Cut off all supplies. Starve them out. Scipio built fortifications around Carthage. Walls and ditches encircling the entire city. A circumvallation that prevented anyone from entering or leaving. He built a mole, a stone causeway, across the harbour entrance, blocking Carthaginian ships from leaving or supply ships from entering. Then he waited. While Carthage starved, the siege continued through 148 and 147 BCE. Inside the city, food supplies dwindled. People ate leather, ate rats, ate anything. But they didn't surrender. In spring 146 BCE, Scipio judged the moment right. The defenders were weakened by starvation. Time for the final assault. Roman forces attacked the harbour area, broke through after brutal fighting, began pushing into the city. Carthage's streets became battlefields, house-to-house fighting. Romans advancing building by building, Carthaginians defending every structure. The fighting lasted 6 days. Romans would capture a building and defenders would retreat to the next one. Set fires behind them, collapse structures. Bodies piled in the streets, so many that soldiers had to walk on corpses. The smell was overwhelming. Death, smoke, burning flesh. On the 7th day, survivors retreated to the Temple of Eshmun on Byrsa Hill, the citadel. About 50,000 civilians and remaining soldiers. Hasdrubal, the Carthaginian commander, surrendered personally, walked out and begged Scipio for mercy. But his wife didn't. She took their 2 children, cursed Hasdrubal as a coward, and threw herself and the children into the burning temple. The remaining defenders, those who didn't surrender, were killed. Those who surrendered were enslaved. The entire population of Carthage, dead or enslaved, and then Scipio destroyed the city, systematically. Buildings were demolished, walls torn down, the harbour filled with rubble, temples desecrated. Everything that made Carthage a city was erased. The story about sowing salt is probably myth. Salt was expensive, and salting hundreds of acres would have been economically absurd. But metaphorically, it's true. Carthage was destroyed so completely that nothing would grow there again. Scipio reportedly wept, stood watching the city burn, and quoted Homer, "A day will come when sacred Troy shall perish, and Priam and his people shall be slain." His companion, the historian Polybius, asked why he wept. Scipio allegedly said, "I weep for Carthage, but also for Rome, because empires that do this, that destroy rivals so completely, eventually face the same fate." Whether he actually said this doesn't matter. The sentiment was prophetic. The Third Punic War lasted 3 years. It wasn't really a war, it was an execution. Carthage had done nothing to provoke it beyond existing. They'd complied with every treaty obligation, paid every indemnity, restricted their military as demanded. And Rome destroyed them anyway. Because they could. Because some Romans, Cato especially, believed that true security meant eliminating potential threats permanently. This was a new Roman doctrine. Not defeating enemies, not conquering them, annihilating them. The territory of Carthage became the Roman province of Africa. The city site remained abandoned for a century before Julius Caesar refounded it as a Roman colony. But Punic Carthage, the civilization that had controlled Mediterranean trade for centuries, that had produced Hannibal, that had nearly defeated Rome, was gone. Let's talk about what the Punic Wars meant, what they changed. Rome entered the First Punic War as a regional Italian power. They emerged from the Third as the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. They'd learned to build navies, to fight across multiple theatres, to sustain decades-long conflicts through manpower and resources, to adapt tactics and learn from defeats. They'd learned that citizen soldiers, while expensive and politically complex, were more reliable than mercenaries. That confederation systems providing deep manpower reserves were strategically superior to hiring armies. They'd learned combined arms warfare, infantry, cavalry, and naval forces working together. They'd learned logistics at unprecedented scales. They'd learned that wars could be won through patience and resources even when losing battles. And they'd learned something darker, that complete destruction of enemies was possible, even necessary in Roman thinking. Because Carthage, broken, compliant, peaceful, had still been perceived as a threat. This lesson would shape Roman imperialism for centuries. Rivals would be crushed completely. Rebellions would be punished with genocidal severity. Rome's peace, the Pax Romana, would be built on the absolute certainty that resistance was futile. Carthage had taught Rome tactics through Hannibal's brilliance. Encirclement, mobility, deception, using cavalry effectively, choosing terrain carefully. But more importantly, Carthage taught Rome strategy through their own defeat. That tactics without logistics fail. That brilliance without resources loses. That winning battles doesn't guarantee winning wars. Rome internalized these lessons, built an empire on them, and became the dominant Mediterranean power for 5 centuries because they'd learned, through 118 years of war, exactly how to wage total war and win. Hannibal was the greatest tactical mind of the ancient world, but Rome was the greatest strategic system. And in the end, systems beat individuals. Tonight, let the full arc of the Punic Wars settle. 3 wars over 118 years. 2 powers that couldn't coexist. One that learned and adapted. One that brilliantly nearly won, but ultimately couldn't overcome structural disadvantages. From the accidental beginning over Messana to the calculated destruction of Carthage itself, this was warfare that transformed the Mediterranean world. Rome learned that they could absorb catastrophic losses and recover. That manpower and resources mattered more than tactical genius. That patience and adaptation could beat brilliance. Carthage learned, too late, that mercenary armies and wealth couldn't substitute for deep reserves and institutional resilience. That winning battles wasn't enough. That Rome would never stop, never forgive, never forget. And both learned that when empires collide, only one survives. There's no shared Mediterranean, no peaceful coexistence. Just domination or destruction. Rome chose domination, and made it permanent by destroying the only power that had ever truly threatened them. The Punic Wars were over. Carthage was erased. And Rome stood alone, master of the sea they'd once feared to cross, the empire built on lessons learned in blood. Let the dust of Carthage settle for a moment. Let the Mediterranean calm. It's 146 BCE. Carthage is gone. The Third Punic War is over. Rome stands alone as the undisputed master of the Western Mediterranean. But something else has happened. Something less visible than battlefield victories or conquered territories. Something that would shape the next 5 centuries of history. Rome's military has been transformed, fundamentally, irreversibly. The army that crossed into Sicily in 264 BCE, citizen farmers serving 1 campaign season, then returning to their fields, no longer exists. The tactics that failed so catastrophically at Cannae have been abandoned. The command structures, the training, the equipment, the doctrine, all of it evolved through 118 years of warfare. Tonight, we're examining that transformation, seeing how defeat taught Rome to build the most effective military machine the ancient world had ever seen. How Hannibal's tactical genius, which nearly destroyed Rome, ultimately made Rome unstoppable. This is the unglamorous part of military history. Not glorious charges or heroic last stands, but organizational reform, tactical adaptation, institutional learning, the slow, methodical process of turning catastrophic failure into systematic victory. Rome didn't just survive the Punic Wars. They learned from them, and what they learned made them an empire. Let's start with the most fundamental change: who served in the legions. Early Republican Rome had a property requirement for military service. You needed to own land, enough to afford your own equipment. Poor citizens couldn't serve because they couldn't equip themselves. This made sense for a city-state fighting seasonal campaigns. Farmers with land had a stake in defending Rome. They'd fight, win or lose, then return to their farms. But the Punic Wars broke this system. Campaigns lasted years, not months. Soldiers spent entire growing seasons away from their farms. Couldn't plant, couldn't harvest. Their farms deteriorated or were seized for debt. Meanwhile, wealthy Romans bought up abandoned land, consolidated it into large estates, latifundia, worked by slaves captured in war. The class of small landholders that formed Rome's military base was shrinking. By 107 BCE, the contradictions were unsustainable. Rome needed soldiers, but fewer citizens qualified. The empire was expanding, but the army was contracting. Gaius Marius, consul and successful general, implemented radical reforms. He opened legion recruitment to all citizens, regardless of property ownership. The state would provide equipment. Soldiers would serve for fixed terms, initially 16 years, later extended to 20 or 25. This created Rome's first professional army. Men who were soldiers by career, not farmers temporarily in uniform. Who trained constantly. Who developed unit cohesion over years, not months. Who were loyal to their commanders, who paid them, equipped them, and promised them land grants upon retirement. But Marius didn't invent these reforms out of nowhere. He was responding to lessons learned during the Punic Wars. Hannibal had shown that professional soldiers beat citizen militia. His African and Spanish veterans, men who'd trained together for years, were tactically superior to Roman soldiers serving their first campaigns. At Cannae, Roman numerical superiority meant nothing. Hannibal's veterans held formation under pressure, executed complex maneuvers, maintained discipline when surrounded. Roman soldiers, however brave, couldn't match that professionalism. Rome learned, you can't create instant armies. Soldiers need training. Time. Experience. The citizen-farmer model worked for local Italian wars. It failed against professional opponents. The Marian reforms institutionalized this lesson. From 107 BCE onward, Roman soldiers were professionals. Career military men who spent decades in service, who could execute complex tactics reliably, who were as disciplined as any force in the ancient world. This was Hannibal's legacy. He'd forced Rome to professionalize or die. They professionalized, and the army they created would conquer the known world. Tactical doctrine evolved too, dramatically. Pre-Punic War, Roman tactics were simple. Form up in 3 lines, march forward, throw javelins, then close for sword combat. Discipline and courage would carry the day. This worked against Italian tribes and Greek phalanxes. It failed catastrophically against Hannibal. Trebia taught Rome that cavalry mattered. That being outflanked was deadly. That infantry alone couldn't win battles. Lake Trasimene taught them about terrain, about reconnaissance, about not marching in column through ambush-friendly defiles when an enemy army was nearby. Cannae taught them everything. About encirclement, about the dangers of deep formations that couldn't maneuver, about how brilliant tactics could turn numerical superiority into a liability. And Zama taught them that their own tactics could be used against them. That Hannibal wasn't unbeatable, his methods were just better than theirs had been. Scipio Africanus became the model. Study your enemy. Adapt their tactics. Use mobility and deception. Coordinate infantry, cavalry, and light troops. Choose your battlefield. Force your enemy to fight where you want, when you want. These principles became Roman military doctrine. Not written down formally, military manuals weren't really a thing yet, but transmitted through training, through veteran officers teaching new recruits, through institutional memory. Legion organization changed fundamentally. Let's talk about what that means practically. The early Republican Legion was organized by wealth and age. The richest young men, the equites, served as cavalry. The next tier, hastati, served as frontline infantry. Behind them, principes, older, more experienced. In the rear, triari, the oldest veterans, a reserve that fought only if the front lines collapsed. This system reflected social hierarchy more than tactical efficiency. But the Punic Wars showed its limitations. Post-Marian legions abandoned class-based organization. Every soldier was equipped identically. Same armor, lorica hamata, chainmail. Same shield, the scutum. Same sword, the gladius. Same javelin, the pilum. Standardization meant flexibility. Any unit could perform any role. No more distinctions between rich cavalry and poor infantry. Just soldiers, organized by experience and capability, not birth. The basic tactical unit became the cohort, roughly 480 men, subdivided into 6 centuries of 80 men each. A legion contained 10 cohorts, about 4,800 men total. Cohorts were small enough to maneuver independently, but large enough to hold ground. They could form different formations, line, column, square, wedge, depending on circumstances. And they could operate separately or combine into larger formations. This flexibility was learned from fighting Hannibal. His armies could split and recombine, could execute complex maneuvers mid-battle. Roman rigidity had cost them at Cannae. Post-war reforms built in the adaptability Hannibal had demonstrated. Equipment evolved too. Specifically, the pilum, Rome's throwing javelin. Pre-Punic War pila were straightforward spears. Throw them, hopefully wound enemies, then draw swords. Post-Punic War pila were engineered weapons, long iron shanks attached to wooden shafts. When thrown, the pilum would penetrate shields. The iron shank was long enough to punch through and hit the man behind. But here's the genius. The shank was designed to bend on impact. Not break, bend. This made the pilum impossible to throw back. And if it stuck in an enemy shield, the weight of the bent shank made the shield unwieldy. Enemies had to either drop their shields or waste time pulling pila out. Either way, they were vulnerable when Romans charged with swords drawn. This wasn't just clever engineering. It was tactical innovation based on combat experience. Someone, probably multiple someones over decades, observed what worked and what didn't, then redesigned equipment accordingly. The gladius, the short sword, was adopted from Spanish tribes during the Second Punic War. Roman soldiers saw how effective it was in close combat, better than longer swords for stabbing in tight formations. More controllable. Deadlier, so they adopted it. No nationalist pride about using Roman weapons. Just pragmatism. If it works, use it. This willingness to learn from enemies, to adapt foreign innovations, was quintessentially Roman, and the Punic Wars forced that adaptability into overdrive. Cavalry remained Rome's weakness. Even after the wars, Roman cavalry was never elite. They recruited it primarily from allies, Gallic horsemen, later Germanic cavalry, eventually Sarmatian heavy cavalry from the steppes. But Rome learned to use cavalry effectively. Not as the decisive arm, that was always infantry, but as support, screening, reconnaissance, pursuit, harassment, and crucially, they learned to counter cavalry. Pike formations, defensive terrain, combined arms tactics where infantry created stable bases that cavalry couldn't break while friendly cavalry protected flanks. Hannibal had beaten Rome with cavalry superiority. Scipio had beaten Hannibal by achieving cavalry superiority. The lesson: you can't neglect cavalry, but you don't have to be the best at it if you can neutralize the enemy's advantage. Rome built an army that was cavalry adequate and infantry dominant. And for the next 5 centuries, that model worked against almost every opponent. Logistics became a science. This might be the most important transformation, though it's the least dramatic. Before the Punic Wars, Roman armies lived off the land when possible, brought supplies from nearby allied cities when necessary. Logistics was improvised, ad hoc, reactive. The Punic Wars, particularly the second, taught Rome that logistics determined campaigns. Hannibal in Italy was always constrained by supply. His tactical brilliance couldn't overcome the reality that he was in enemy territory with no reliable supply chain. Rome learned, control logistics and you control the campaign. An army that can't eat can't fight, no matter how well trained. Post-war Roman armies included massive logistics trains, mules and carts carrying food, equipment, tools, medical supplies. Every legion had engineers, blacksmiths, carpenters, medics, support personnel who kept the fighting force operational. Roman camps, built every night when on campaign, were fortified positions. Ditches, ramparts, organized layouts, not just for defense but for organization. Supply distribution, medical treatment, command structure. Building these camps was exhausting work after a day's march. But it meant Roman armies were never vulnerable to night attack, were never disorganized, always had a defensive position to fall back to. And it meant Roman campaigns could last indefinitely. As long as supply lines held, legions could operate anywhere, for years if necessary. This was the strategic advantage that beat Hannibal. Not tactics, he was better tactically than most Roman generals. But Rome could sustain losses, rebuild armies, maintain multiple fronts, and keep fighting. Hannibal couldn't. Command structure evolved too. The annual consulship system, where generals rotated every year, had caused disasters during the Punic Wars. Inconsistent strategy. Incompetent commanders who got the position through political connections rather than military skill. Generals more concerned with winning glory before their term ended than with long-term campaign planning. After the wars, Rome increasingly appointed proconsuls and propraetors, extended commands that lasted multiple years. This allowed strategic continuity. Generals could develop campaigns, learn from mistakes, build institutional knowledge. Scipio Africanus in Spain was the model. Multi-year command, autonomy to make decisions, authority to negotiate with tribes and restructure military operations. He wasn't rotating out every 12 months, starting fresh with each campaign season. This flexibility made Roman military operations more effective. But it also created a new danger. Successful generals with long commands, loyal armies, and popular support could threaten the Republic itself. Julius Caesar eventually would prove this. His command in Gaul, extended repeatedly, gave him a veteran army loyal to him personally. When the Senate tried to recall him, he marched on Rome instead. The Punic Wars taught Rome to give generals autonomy. They'd learn later that autonomous generals with loyal armies were dangerous to republican government. But that problem came later. For now, in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE, Rome's military reforms made them unstoppable. Training became systematic. Professional soldiers needed professional training. Recruits drilled constantly. Marching. Formation changes. Weapons practice. Not just learning, practicing until movements were automatic. Until a soldier could form testudo, the tortoise formation with overlapping shields, without thinking. Could build a camp in darkness. Could follow orders in the chaos of battle. This was learned from Hannibal. His veterans executed complex maneuvers at Cannae because they'd trained together for years. They didn't need to think. They reacted. Rome built the same capability. Soldiers trained together, fought together, developed unit cohesion that made them tactically reliable. And they learned from combat. Every campaign taught lessons. Which formations worked in forests versus open ground. How to assault fortified cities. How to build siege equipment. How to counter elephants, still occasionally used by Eastern kingdoms. This institutional learning, absorbing lessons from each campaign, transmitting them through training, constantly refining tactics, was Rome's greatest military strength. Individual generals might be brilliant or incompetent, but the system was excellent. And systems beat individuals. Engineering became central to military operations. Romans had always been good builders. We covered their architectural achievements extensively. But the Punic Wars integrated engineering into military doctrine. Every legion included engineers, fabri, who built siege equipment, constructed bridges, designed fortifications, created fieldworks. When Caesar later conquered Gaul, his legions built bridges across the Rhine in 10 days. Built siege works at Alesia that encircled an enemy stronghold with defensive fortifications facing both directions, keeping enemies in while keeping relieving forces out. This engineering capability came from lessons learned besieging Carthaginian strongholds in Sicily and Spain, from watching Hannibal fortify positions, from Scipio's siege of New Carthage. Rome realized battles are won before they're fought. Positioning, fortifications, supply lines. Engineering solves all these problems. So they made engineering part of military training. Every soldier learned to build, to dig, to construct. Fighting was important, but creating tactical advantages through engineering was just as important. By 100 BCE, Rome had transformed from a confederation with citizen militia into a professional empire with standing armies. The legions numbered roughly 300,000 men, unprecedented in the ancient world. Stationed across the Mediterranean, from Spain to Syria, professional, disciplined, equipped with standardized gear and systematic training. They could march 20 miles a day, then build a fortified camp. Fight a battle the next day, do it again for months. Operate in any terrain, forests, mountains, deserts. Besiege cities. Fight pitched battles. Adapt to any enemy. This was the military machine the Punic Wars created, not through one brilliant reform, but through decades of incremental adaptation, learning from defeats, studying enemies, refining tactics, institutionalizing what worked. Hannibal had nearly destroyed Rome, but in forcing Rome to evolve or die, he created the force that would conquer his homeland and then everything else. There's a darker lesson here too. One Rome learned too well. Total war works. Complete destruction of enemies works. Mercy is weakness. Carthage proved this. Rome tried negotiated peace after the First Punic War. Carthage recovered and returned stronger. Tried it again after the Second. Carthage still existed, still prosperous, still potentially threatening. Only after the Third Punic War, when Carthage was erased completely, did the threat end permanently. Rome internalized this lesson. From now on, enemies would be crushed completely or subjugated utterly. Rebellions would be punished with genocidal severity. Resistance would be met with disproportionate violence designed to terrorize others into submission. The Punic Wars taught Rome military excellence, but they also taught Rome ruthlessness. The combination made them unstoppable and terrifying. Tonight, let that transformation settle. The Roman military reborn through defeat, learning from Hannibal, adapting Carthaginian tactics, building an army that combined Roman discipline with the professionalism and tactical flexibility that had nearly destroyed them. This is how empires are built. Not through one brilliant general or one decisive battle, but through institutional learning, through systems that absorb failure and extract lessons, through organizations that improve constantly, incrementally, relentlessly. Hannibal was the greatest tactical commander of his age, possibly of any age, and he lost because he faced a system that learned faster than he could win. Rome's transformation from defeated republic to unstoppable military machine is the real victory of the Punic Wars. More important than any single battle. More enduring than any territorial conquest. They'd learned how to build an army that could conquer the known world, and over the next century, they'd do exactly that. The Mediterranean wasn't big enough for Rome and Carthage. Now it wasn't big enough for Rome and anyone else either. It's 146 BCE, Carthage is smoking rubble. The threat that terrorized Rome for over a century is gone. Hannibal has been dead for 37 years. The Punic Wars are finally, definitively over. Rome stands alone, master of the Western Mediterranean. No rival naval power, no competing empire, no one left who can challenge them. And they're not done. Not even close. Over the next century, Rome will conquer everything: Greece, Macedon, Asia Minor, Syria, Egypt, Gaul. The entire Mediterranean becomes a Roman lake, Mare Nostrum, our sea. Tonight, we're watching what happens when the military machine forged in the Punic Wars, professional, adaptable, ruthless, turns its attention to the rest of the known world. When lessons learned, fighting Carthage get applied systematically to everyone else. This is the transformation of the Mediterranean world, the century when regional powers became imperial subjects, when independent kingdoms became Roman provinces, when Roman stopped meaning a city and started meaning an empire spanning 3 continents. And we're seeing how the Punic Wars made this possible, how every tactical innovation, every strategic lesson, every institutional reform born from fighting Carthage became the foundation for conquering everyone else. Let's watch an empire built on lessons learned in blood. The first target was already engaged, Macedon. Remember Philip V, the Macedonian king who'd allied with Hannibal during the Second Punic War. Rome hadn't forgotten. The First Macedonian War, 214 to 205 BCE, happened while Hannibal was still in Italy. Rome fought defensively, preventing Philip from reinforcing Carthage. The peace treaty was inconclusive, neither side won decisively. But it established something crucial. Rome was now operating in the eastern Mediterranean, not just defending Italy or fighting in Sicily, projecting power across the sea into Greece and Macedon. The Second Macedonian War, 200–197 BCE, started immediately after the Second Punic War ended. Rome's legions, veterans of fighting Hannibal, sailed east and crushed Philip's phalanx-based armies at Cynocephalae in 197 BCE. This battle demonstrated something important. Roman legions were superior to Macedonian phalanxes. The phalanx, rows of infantry with long pikes, was effective in open terrain but inflexible. The Roman manipular system, smaller units that could adapt to terrain and gaps in enemy lines, was superior tactically. The Punic Wars had taught Rome flexibility. Hannibal's victories came from adapting tactics to circumstances. Scipio had copied that adaptability and beat Hannibal with it. Now Rome used that same flexibility against Macedonian rigidity, and it worked. Every time, Philip was forced to surrender his fleet, pay indemnities, and withdraw from Greece. Rome declared the Greek cities free, though free under Roman protection meant they were effectively client states. This was the Roman model emerging: defeat enemies decisively, impose terms that prevent them from threatening Rome again, create client relationships that look like freedom but function as control. The Seleucid Empire was next. Another Hellenistic kingdom, successor to Alexander the Great's empire, controlling Syria, parts of Asia Minor, and the Near East. King Antiochus III, called the Great optimistically, decided Rome was overstretched. They'd just fought Carthage for decades. Surely they were exhausted. Surely they couldn't fight in the east too. He was wrong. Antiochus invaded Greece in 192 BCE, bringing an army that included war elephants, heavy cavalry, and the famous Seleucid phalanx. Rome sent legions under Scipio Africanus's brother, Lucius Cornelius Scipio, with Scipio Africanus serving as advisor. They met at Magnesia in 190 BCE. The Seleucid army numbered perhaps 70,000. Rome had about 30,000, mostly Roman and Italian allied troops. The Romans won decisively, used the same tactics that worked against Macedon, flexible manipular formations breaking rigid phalanxes. And they'd learned how to counter elephants, remember Zama. Light infantry with javelins, creating gaps for elephants to pass through, then killing the mahouts and turning the elephants back into their own lines. Antiochus lost roughly 50,000 men. He surrendered, paid massive indemnities, 15,000 talents over 12 years, and withdrew from Asia Minor. Rome took control of Seleucid territories in modern-day Turkey, gave some to allied kingdoms like Pergamon, kept strategic positions for themselves. The pattern was repeating: defeat, impose terms, establish control. The lessons from Carthage, that total victory prevents future threats, were being applied systematically. Macedon tried again. Philip V's son, Perseus, attempted to rebuild Macedonian power in the 170s BCE. The Third Macedonian War, 171–168 BCE, ended at Pydna in 168 BCE. Roman legions, now veterans of multiple campaigns, destroyed the Macedonian phalanx so completely that Macedon never recovered. Perseus was captured. Paraded through Rome in a triumph, the traditional victory celebration where defeated kings walked in chains behind victorious generals. Then imprisoned for life. Macedon was divided into 4 weak republics, forbidden from interacting with each other. Not annexed yet, Rome was still figuring out how to govern conquered territories, but effectively neutralized. 20 years later, after a brief rebellion, Rome annexed Macedon entirely. It became a province. The kingdom of Alexander the Great, the power that had conquered the known world 150 years earlier, was now a Roman administrative district. Greece itself was next. The Achaean League, a confederation of Greek city-states, resisted Roman dominance in 146 BCE. The same year Carthage fell, Rome crushed the Achaean rebellion. Sacked Corinth, one of Greece's wealthiest cities, with the same thoroughness they'd destroyed Carthage. Killed the men. Enslaved the women and children. Burned the city. Looted its treasures and shipped them to Rome. Greece became the province of Achaea. The birthplace of philosophy, democracy, and classical civilization was now Roman territory, governed by Roman proconsuls, taxed to fund Roman wars, its treasures decorating Roman temples and villas. The symbolism was complete. The student had become the master. Rome, which had learned art, philosophy, and culture from Greece, now ruled it. But here's what's crucial. Rome didn't destroy Greek culture. They absorbed it, admired it. Wealthy Romans learned Greek, studied Greek philosophy, collected Greek art. Even as they conquered Greece militarily, they submitted to Greece culturally. This was different from Carthage. Carthage was erased. Greece was conquered but preserved. Why? Because Rome saw Greece as civilized, as culturally valuable. Carthage they saw as an existential threat. The lesson Rome was learning: destruction is for threats. Subjugation is for everyone else. In the West, Spain was being slowly pacified. This took generations. Not because Spain's armies were strong, but because the terrain was difficult and the tribes resistant. The Lusitanian War, 155–139 BCE, and Numantine War, 143–133 BCE, showed Rome's ruthlessness. When the fortress city of Numantia refused to surrender after years of siege, Rome sent Scipio Aemilianus, the destroyer of Carthage, to finish it. He built siege works, starved the city, then razed it completely. The surviving population was sold into slavery. This was becoming Rome's signature: resistance equals annihilation. Submit and you might keep some autonomy. Resist and you're erased. Spain's pacification took until Augustus's reign, another century, but Roman control was inevitable. Not because Spanish tribes couldn't fight, but because Rome would keep sending legions until they won. They'd learned from fighting Hannibal: attrition works if you have deeper reserves. The eastern Mediterranean was being systematically absorbed. Pergamon, a wealthy kingdom in Asia Minor, allied with Rome, bequeathed itself to Rome when its last king died in 133 BCE. Just gave the entire kingdom to Rome in his will. Why? Because he had no heirs and knew his kingdom would be fought over by neighbours. Better to give it to Rome peacefully and hope they'd maintain stability. Rome accepted. Pergamon became the province of Asia. One of the richest provinces in the empire, its taxes funded Roman expansion for decades. This established a new pattern: kingdoms could peacefully become Roman provinces. No war necessary. Just acknowledge reality: Rome was the dominant power, and submit voluntarily. Many kingdoms chose this path. Better to keep local elites in power under Roman oversight than risk Rome sending legions and doing it the hard way. Egypt was watching all this nervously. The Ptolemaic kingdom, descendants of one of Alexander's generals, was the last major Hellenistic power. Wealthy, ancient, strategically positioned. But they'd learned from Macedon and the Seleucids. Don't fight Rome. Accommodate them. Throughout the 2nd century BCE, Egypt maintained friendly relations with Rome, sent grain during shortages, supported Roman campaigns diplomatically, positioned themselves as a valuable ally, not a threat. It worked. For a while. Egypt remained independent until 30 BCE, when Octavian, later Augustus, finally annexed it after defeating Cleopatra and Mark Antony. But even Egypt's independence was illusory. They survived by Roman permission, by being useful. The moment they became a threat or ceased being useful, Rome would absorb them. Every power in the Mediterranean understood this by 100 BCE. Rome was the hegemon. The only question was whether you'd submit peacefully or be conquered violently. Let's talk about what this expansion meant economically. Because empires aren't built on military victories alone. They're built on resources. Each conquered province generated tax revenue. Silver from Spain's mines, grain from Sicily and Africa, luxury goods from Asia, slaves from everywhere. The Second Punic War had nearly bankrupted Rome. By 100 BCE, they were the wealthiest state in the Mediterranean. Provincial taxes funded everything: the legions, public works, grain subsidies for Roman citizens. This created a feedback loop. Conquest generated wealth. Wealth funded armies. Armies conquered more territory. More territory generated more wealth. And Roman citizens benefited directly. Successful generals distributed loot to their soldiers, brought back slaves who depressed labor costs and displaced free workers, shipped grain to Rome, keeping prices low and citizens fed. The Roman people, especially the urban poor, had every incentive to support conquest. It made them wealthier and more secure. Why wouldn't they approve endless expansion? But this created dependencies. Rome's economy now required continuous conquest. Stop expanding and the wealth flow stopped. Tax revenues plateaued. Armies became expensive rather than profitable. The empire had to keep growing to sustain itself. This wasn't ideology. It was economic necessity dressed as destiny. Militarily, Rome was learning lessons about occupation. Conquest was relatively easy. Legions were excellent at defeating armies. Occupation was harder. Spain taught this lesson painfully. Defeating Spanish tribes in battle was straightforward. Keeping them pacified required permanent garrisons, constant patrols, brutal reprisals against rebellion. Rome developed occupation doctrine, install local elites who'd govern on Rome's behalf. Let them keep power and wealth in exchange for loyalty and tax collection. Roman proconsuls oversaw things, but local administration remained local. This was efficient, cheaper than direct rule. And it worked, mostly. Local elites had incentives to maintain order. Rebellion risked losing their position and wealth, but it created new problems. Some local elites were corrupt, exploiting populations and enriching themselves. Some were incompetent. Some were loyal to Rome only as long as Rome was strong. The empire was building a system that worked through complexity rather than direct control. It was scalable, could govern vast territories with relatively small Roman administrative presence. But it was also fragile, dependent on local cooperation that could evaporate if Rome showed weakness. The psychological impact on Rome itself was profound. They'd gone from fearing Hannibal to dominating the Mediterranean in less than a century. Roman identity changed. They weren't just defending Italy anymore. They were builders of empire. Bringers of civilization, in their view, destined to rule. This was the ideological justification that emerged. Rome brought order, law, peace. The Pax Romana, Roman peace, enforced by legions but beneficial to all. Trade flourished under Roman protection. Cities grew. Infrastructure improved. And this was partly true. Roman roads, aqueducts, and legal systems did improve life in many provinces. Trade did increase. Piracy decreased. Borders were secure. But it was also self-serving mythology. Rome brought peace by conquering everyone. Imposed order through military occupation. Their civilization was built on slavery, exploitation, and the constant threat of violence. Still, the mythology worked. Romans believed it. Many provincial populations accepted it. And it justified continued expansion. They weren't conquering for greed, but to bring civilization to barbarians. This is how empires think. Conquest becomes civilizing mission, domination becomes benevolent order, and violence becomes necessary for peace. By 50 BCE, a century after Carthage's destruction, Rome controlled the entire Mediterranean. From Spain to Syria, from Gaul to Egypt, from the Atlantic to the Black Sea. No rival existed. No power could challenge them. The Mediterranean was Roman. Completely. Undisputedly. This was unprecedented in ancient history. Empires had controlled large territories before, but no one had unified the entire Mediterranean under single rule. Rome did it in a century, using legions forged fighting Carthage, using tactics learned from Hannibal, using strategic doctrine developed through 118 years of existential warfare. The Punic Wars were Rome's education. The next century was their graduation project, and they passed with overwhelming success. But Scipio Aemilianus's warning, weeping as Carthage burned, predicting Rome would face the same fate, was prophetic. Empires that conquer through violence eventually consume themselves. Rome's expansion created wealth but also inequality. Generals became more powerful than the state. Soldiers became loyal to commanders rather than Rome. The very military system that made Rome invincible would eventually destroy the Republic. Julius Caesar, great-great-grandson of Scipio Africanus through adoption, would cross the Rubicon with legions loyal to him personally and plunge Rome into civil war. The empire built through Punic War lessons would survive. The Republic wouldn't, but that's another story. For tonight, understand this: Rome conquered the Mediterranean because they learned from defeat, because they adapted systematically, because they built institutions that preserved lessons across generations. Hannibal nearly destroyed them, but in doing so, he taught them how to be unstoppable. Let's end with the lessons. The timeless principles that the Punic Wars teach about warfare, strategy, and empire. Lesson 1. Tactical brilliance without strategic resources fails. Hannibal won almost every battle. It didn't matter. Rome's manpower, wealth, and institutional depth meant they could lose battles and still win the war. Tactics matter. But strategy, logistics, resources, alliances, political will matters more. Lesson 2. Adaptation beats innovation. Rome wasn't the most innovative military power. They copied the Corvus from shipbuilding principles, adopted the gladius from Spanish tribes, learned combined arms from Hannibal, but they adapted faster than anyone else, turned every defeat into a lesson, built systems that learned, and that systematic adaptation beat individual genius. Lesson 3. Total war works but creates total enmity. Rome learned that negotiated peace with strong rivals doesn't last. Only complete victory, destruction, or subjugation prevents future threats. This worked. But it also meant Rome had to conquer everyone or be perpetually at war. There was no middle path. Lesson 4. Institutional strength trumps individual brilliance. Hannibal was possibly the greatest battlefield commander in history. He lost because he faced a system, not an individual. Rome's confederation structure, its ability to raise armies repeatedly, its institutional learning, these beat his personal genius. Systems outlast individuals. Always. Lesson 5. Victory's lessons are as important as defeats. Rome learned from losing at Cannae, but they also learned from winning at Zama, from conquering Spain, from defeating Macedon. They systematically extracted lessons from every campaign, every battle, every conquest. This continuous learning process made them progressively more effective. Lesson 6. Empire requires continuous expansion until it can't expand anymore. Rome's imperial economy depended on conquest. The wealth flow, the slave labor, the political rewards for successful generals all required continuous expansion. This worked brilliantly for 200 years. Then they hit limits: geographic, logistical, economic, and the system started failing. Empires that depend on expansion eventually run out of places to expand. Lesson 7. The weapons that build empires eventually destroy them. Rome created professional armies to defeat Carthage. Those armies then conquered the Mediterranean. But professional armies loyal to generals rather than the state eventually destroyed the Republic. The tools of empire become the instruments of its dissolution. Tonight, let all of it settle. The 3 wars over 118 years. The transformation of Rome from regional power to Mediterranean hegemon. The lessons learned in blood and inscribed in institutional memory. The Punic Wars were Rome's crucible, the fire that forged them into an empire. Hannibal was the hammer that struck them, and instead of breaking, they became harder. Carthage taught Rome how to fight, how to adapt, how to build armies and strategies and institutions that could conquer the world. And Rome did, systematically, ruthlessly, completely. The Mediterranean, that sea Carthage once controlled through naval dominance, that Rome once feared to cross, became Roman. Mare Nostrum, our sea, not through destiny, not through divine favor, through learning, through adaptation, through the stubborn refusal to accept defeat as final. Rome lost battles, lost armies, lost hundreds of thousands of soldiers, but they learned from every loss, adapted every tactic, refined every strategy until they became unstoppable. That's the legacy of the Punic Wars. Not just territorial conquest or military victories, but the transformation of defeat into education, of catastrophe into adaptation, of near death into rebirth as something far more dangerous. Hannibal crossed the Alps to destroy Rome. Instead, he taught them how to conquer the world. And 2,000 years later, we're still studying what Rome learned, still applying Hannibal's tactics in military academies, still analyzing how Rome built an empire from the ashes of near annihilation. The wars are long over. The empires are dust. Carthage is ruins. Rome is ruins. But the lessons remain, sharp, clear, timeless, and that, in the end, is what truly lasts.